All right, welcome to Broadway Drumming 101. My guest today is Rich Rosenzweig. Thank you for being here, Rich.
It's great to be here and finally see you, not in the flesh, but to see you, Clayton. Yeah, after knowing about you for a long time.
Yes, and it's funny, we're far apart here, but at our jobs, we're right across the street from one another.
It occurred to me as well, and I hope we get a chance to do a little espresso or something between shows because, hey, that's part of the fun of the community that we have out there.
Indeed. Now, you are at company.
Yes, and about to do our like 14th or 15th preview and opening a week from yesterday.
Which is what date will you be opening?
Ooh,
December 9th?
December 9th sounds right. Yeah.
So, company will be your 11th show?
I think that's correct also. Yeah. The only reason why I hesitate is just because of, the before times, as people are calling it. Ever since then, you lose track of certain things that you had been keeping track of before. But yeah, that sounds right.
Well, we're going to go deep a deep dive into your history because I'd like to know how'd you get to 11. But you started out by playing drums at, I guess, 11 years old, correct?
That sounds about right. Yeah. It was after taking a few years of what was sort of an obligatory few years of piano lessons in my family. I'm the oldest of four boys, and my parents were very much into the arts. My mom plays piano, and luckily, I will say freely that arts all of the arts were a big part of my childhood. So I had the few years of piano. I sort of liked it, but that particular discipline wasn't hitting me at the age of 9, 10, 11. And drumming seemed like fun. I can say clearly that I wasn't that kid who was banging on pots and pans beforehand, and the parents said, all right, give him a drum set, let him get it out of his system. I kind of moved to drums. I wish I could say what the epiphany moment was, but I took the lessons in grammar school, which were group lessons with the woman music teacher. And I only make a point about that is because that would have been at that time in the 60s, very clearly a music teacher who knew a little bit about everything. We all had our drum pads and we took the group lessons. It seemed like fun. And then it took not only the love of music, which was what I was obsessive about, and a teacher that I got, I think, towards the end of my years in junior high, a guy named Harry Sabanjan, who actually died relatively young, but was a fun guy to have. And he came over the house. And so I got those lessons with him for about 4 years.
So, what are group drum lessons like? I don't think I've ever really done that,
Yeah,
especially as a kid.
I think at least in our school system, if you took an instrument in grammar school, uh, I guess all the kids who played that instrument would gather in the music teacher's office. And in that case, there was only one music teacher. So we had, wow, this might sound real prehistoric, wooden drum pads with a layer of rubber on top.
Oh, yeah.
And this was before Remo practice pads. And we learned the rudiments. I think there were three or four of us. I think the teacher's name was Mrs. Marsick, and took the lessons. And then my parents opted to get me a used snare drum when I was about 12, but I quickly needed to graduate to some sort of drum set. So sometime around my bar mitzvah, I think, I graduated to a Ludwig standard set. Oh, I'm sure everybody in your show reminisces about that first drum set and
Mm-hmm.
what it was like. I think it wasn't quite that tiger stripe, but got the three-piece kit. Very frustrating that I didn't have that floor tom to make the full uh, tom fill when I first started out.
It was two
Um,
rack toms.
no, just one.
Okay.
Uh, boy, I guess it would show my age that to get a drum set with two rack toms, no, I guess by 1970 or 71 you could have, but it was just one rack tom. And I remember as an aside, it's funny we're talking about this. In camp, I wanted to sit in with a drummer who was playing in a rock band, and I'd never played with a band before, but I thought I'd learn a beat or two. And I wait a second, I'm getting this story wrong. I did have a floor tom. He did not have a floor tom. And when I went to make the fill, I went around and literally, even though I could see in front of me, there was no floor tom, I played, it was like an air ball for a drummer. But anyway, that's just a bizarre story about remembering your first drum set and those awkward years.
You played in a basement of your house?
Oh yeah, the classic basement situation, where I guess to a certain extent I drove my family crazy. I also practiced in my bedroom, which was pretty small, but that's where my first little stereo was, where I would practice to records. But either way, it was noisy. And when I would jam with my mom, who would play piano, that might be fun. But still, to this day, I guess, unless kids grow up with a drum set where they plug it in and put their headphones on, it's just, that's one thing that wouldn't have changed, is just driving your family crazy.
Yeah, I remember doing that with my mother. I used to come home from school every day and practice from like 3:30 to excuse me, to like 6, and my mother would bang on the door, Clayton, time to eat, time to eat. You can stop playing, but I just would just keep playing, put on those records. So you used to play to the radio, or did you play to records when you were little? Like, what was your?
Because of my age, you were going to say. No, that's a good question. I can, and I was even going to ask you, when you say you were practicing, what were the first records that you played to? I uh, I certainly listened to my transistor radio or the clock radios. That was always exciting to get the new upgrade when they went from analog to digital. Listened to the radio all the time, recorded with my Craig cassette recorder, the top 40, but I had a record player, and I can remember that the first singles that I played along to, uh, Evil Ways by Santana, maybe a Creedence Clearwater Revival tune, I don't remember which one, and then I wasn't just getting singles. I mean, Beatles, the Monkees, admittedly, because even before I played drums, that was, I mean, it was a cool pop culture thing to get into when you were 8 years old or 9 years old. But the Beatles definitely, and then didn't, not at the expense of rock or pop, but jazz really kind of grabbed me pretty early on.
Before, excuse me, before you went to, you went to college, I'm assuming.
Yes, I did, but way before. Actually, if I talk about it, even though all of us talk about, all of us drummers talk about the phases we went through, for me, at least in my world, getting into jazz was not an anomaly, but it was rare. But the reasons for that were, my parents liked it, and even though they were the earlier generation, I didn't fight them too much on their tastes, because I got exposed to everything, and they loved the big band era stuff, and I still loved it. I think, well, I should say, definitely the gapping that bridging that gap. Okay, that's what I meant to say. You can edit that out. Bridging that gap had a lot to do with Buddy Rich, because most drummers are going to go through that Buddy Rich phase. And if you were lucky enough and old enough to go hear him, that was too much of a no-brainer that he was going to blow you away, whether you were into jazz or not. So you're exposed to that. And as a result, you hear the music, and something that was very momentous for me was getting into big bands at that age, and Maynard Ferguson, which was a big thing in my high school. I would hear big bands from the time I was 13, and Buddy Rich came through town a couple of times. One time he was replaced last minute by Louis Bellson, and it was amazing. But soon after, Basie's band came through, and I went to hear them with Harold Jones on drums. And I can say, remembering very clearly, how as exciting as Buddy's music was, and again, not taking away from that, but dynamically and musically, Basie's music and the drumming that went with it really had an effect on me. So that kept me really into jazz. And then the other thing for me, notably in high school, other than wanting to play in the jazz band, was one of my classmates was the son of pianist Teddy Wilson, one of the great jazz pianists of the swing era. And his name was Billy. And we formed a jazz quintet with another high school mate of mine, Jim Hines, who wound up becoming a very important trumpet player in New York.
Oh, yeah,
and
great.
we had a quintet called Take Five, and we were into playing all kinds of jazz, and we did a lot of club date type things, but we were a bunch of 15, 16-year-olds who were playing music for the older generation. But jazz-wise, other than Take Five, we were playing traditional jazz, older stuff from the 30s and 40s and standards. So I got exposed to standards early on, and my tastes in jazz, even though I was still following pop, very much followed the timeline of how jazz evolved. So that by the time I was in college, and this is my really long way of answering your question, I went to school in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Didn't major in music because my goal was just to get a good liberal arts education, and didn't decide to be a drummer till I was probably a junior in college, where I thought, if I don't give this a try, I'll regret it the rest of my life. But in college, I got into bebop and then beyond. And by the time I graduated college, I had joined a trio called Hands that had been a local amazing group that I heard in Chapel Hill that had Frank Kimbrough on piano and Lyles West on bass. And Frank, who became one of the best jazz pianists in New York City, is the guy I moved to New York with. And your listeners may or may not know that he suddenly passed away last December, which was a tough shock for everybody. But he had a huge, profound influence on my life as a musician. And this is all to say that by the time I was in college and had left college, I was into playing lots of free avant-garde acoustic jazz. So that sort of takes you up to my bio, eventually moving to New York about a year after I graduated.
Now, what did you study in college?
At the school there, they had a major called RTVMP, which was radio, television, and motion pictures, which was sort of their communications department. And
Okay.
I was really into film and radio, and I thought that not only because of that, but because that particular major required that you take a lot of liberal arts. And I was always, though it goes against the stereotype of musicians, the kind of person who leaned towards history and English as opposed to math and science. And that was my comfort zone. And that's what I wanted to get out of Chapel Hill. Musically, they had a pretty decent music department for a big university. I played in the jazz band. I played in the wind ensemble. I did a lot of gigs on the outside, but it wasn't my major. And I don't regret that.
Now, why University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and not someplace closer to home?
Good question. So the bottom lines for me when I went were I think my folks were probably a little overwhelmed that I was the first of four boys that they hoped would go to college. And they said, all right, we probably are not going to be able to do a private school for you because that would be expensive. So a state school, and if you don't want to go to Rutgers, which was a great school for a kid who grew up in New Jersey and would have been less expensive because it was in state, they said, you can do a state school, but wherever you want. And I wanted to be on the East Coast, but I didn't want to be too far from home. I didn't want to be 10 minutes from home. So I picked four schools, UMass, where I had to at least visit because Max Roach was a teacher there. And I thought, damn, I got to check that out. And the day I visited the school, when I was looking at schools, he was not around. So that put a little damper on that visit. But when I did visit the other schools, I went to University of Virginia to check it out, which is a beautiful school. But Chapel Hill just struck me as a really good, actually liberal haven for a place that was otherwise in the middle of Jesse Helms land, who was the senator at the time, who was, let's just say, not the most forward-thinking dude at the time. But Chapel Hill was cool. It seemed fairly liberal, although I quickly found out that the student body was more conservative than I thought, and the faculty was always pretty liberal.
You said you're a film buff.
Yeah, always. I mean, in thinking about doing this, and you're thinking about like reviewing things that were a big part of your childhood and your life, I think I always came back to the fact that I was just obsessed about all the arts. And I was a huge movie fan, comedy fan. I was obsessed for a while with old monster movies like Frankenstein and Dracula. And other than subscribing to Mad Magazine, like a lot of kids my age, which you're introduced to satire, I subscribed to Famous Monsters of Filmland, which was a really geeky magazine that focused, excuse me, on all the classic old, especially the Universal movie monsters like Frankenstein and Dracula. I had the posters. And I even went through a phase where I was so obsessed with the minutia of it that the makeup artist who was famous for making up Boris Karloff and Lon Chaney to be the Frankenstein monster and the Wolfman was so fascinating to me that I went through a brief phase where I wanted to be a makeup artist for film, nose putty, and I would lock myself in my parents' bathroom and put on all kinds of fake scars. And anyway, this is kind of a tangent, but as you and I were
say tangent alert.
Exactly. But I guess like you and I were briefly talking about before, it's all part of whatever makes up a person's persona. And all of these were obsessions, but in the end, not only music won out, but jazz in particular. And I'll even say that beyond being obsessed about drums, I think I was also that type of musician that it was more about the music and wanting to be a part of music in a bigger sense rather than being a drumhead in terms of it being all about the gear and being obsessed about the drummers who had incredible technique, which was all cool. But in the end, I was more obsessed about the music itself. I don't know if that makes sense. Well, if you know what maybe you can clarify that.
This interesting thing about that is that talking to the drummers on the podcast, even especially Warren Oates, when I spoke with him, he kind of changed my perspective on what I do, or what we do. It's not just getting up there and playing a groove or playing a shuffle or whatever groove you're going to be playing. You're supporting the entire picture there, and you're helping paint a picture and support the people that are on stage. And of course, you're one of the pieces of the orchestra,
right?
Paying attention to the conductor, who's the liaison between the orchestra and the actors, and that conductor is basically helping with creating the visual and the audio and connecting those two. But in addition, of course, you're part of the entire organization where your snare drum hit will trigger a light, a dance cue, or a piece of furniture moving on. So, looking at what you're talking about, or listening to what you're talking about,
Right,
being
right.
a film buff, and I was just going to ask you about doing, even thinking about doing, what's it called? I mean, not orchestrations, but soundtracks. Did
Right.
you ever, look when you look at films? Do you look at it from the bigger picture? It's like, oh, I want to. Did you ever think about getting into that aspect of filmmaking?
You know, firstly, I would get out of the way that I've never aspired to be a composer. However, you're getting into something that, yes, is interesting for me. And first, I'll just say, going back to what you're saying before, yes, time and again, and listening to your podcast and talking to other people about Broadway drumming, it always hits home that what we do when we're working on Broadway is a very unique beast that always, at time and again, you're reminded that there's no gig like it. And I did hear Warren talk about it, and it was interesting to be explained the way he explained it. But as far as and we are a cog in that huge machine, more so than any other type of music, where you're still learning in a band. You're the drummer. You're not. It's not just you, but you take that to the highest level, and that is the Broadway musical, more than an opera, more than even just a dance performance where there might be live music. Now, having said that, as far as connecting the visuals to music, I have always been obsessed with music soundtracks and how they affect film, and became a fan of certain film composers pretty early on, I guess. For an average kid, you become aware of, and certainly before John Williams, who was maybe the first star film composer of the last 50 years. But when let's see, I think two composers in particular come to mind, and they had an effect on me musically, were Bernard Herrmann, because I was obsessed early on with the film Taxi Driver. And when you get into all the aspects of it, not just the actor and maybe what happens in the action, but damn, why does this movie look different? And damn, that music just stays with you. And I learned it was Bernard Herrmann who composed that score and then proceeded to pass away the night they finished recording it. And then you look back and say, his first film was Citizen Kane, and everything in between was monumental. He composed about 5 or so of Hitchcock's scores. And yeah, if you've seen Psycho and you ask anybody, what are the things they remember about it beyond the shower scene, they're going to say it's that music. So this hit me early on, and I wanted to know more about Bernard Herrmann. I even did a paper in college about the music to Citizen Kane. The other composer was Ennio Morricone, who just passed away recently. And I remember going to see Once Upon a Time in America in New York early on when I first moved here, which, and please stop me if this is going off track here, but I remember going to see it, and it was not what you would call the director's cut. It was a much shorter film, shorter meaning 2.5 hours. And it came on the heels of The Godfather, and it was a big gangster epic, but it was made by an Italian, Sergio Leone, the guy who made all the spaghetti westerns, which in America for a while, I think a lot of people thought they were funny because it was Clint Eastwood and the rest of the actors were Italian, and it was dubbed and there was very little dialogue. But that music, and this is also, again, way beyond just the hit single record that they had with the theme to The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. The music that Ennio Morricone wrote, just, you were left with this not as good shorter version. If you see the longer, I guess you would call it the director's cut, it's amazing. But that music really stayed with you. And I had a couple of friends who were not musicians. And after I saw the movie, I talked to them and they said, oh yeah, Ennio Morricone, we have a club where we get together and just listen to Ennio Morricone records.
Wow.
And I'm saying, wow, that's a pretty deep dive. This would have been in the mid 80s, but that music stays with you. And I mean, I'm not going to go through the list of his credits, but he lived to his mid 90s and his resume is incredible. And I'm sure a lot of your listeners know who I'm talking about. And then to just bring this full circle, by the time I formed my own jazz septet in the 90s, I wanted in different ways for it to be distinctive. And what can I do that, without forcing it too much, that will make this band a little distinctive? And one of them was to play arrangements of film score, not just the theme song, but music. And on our first of just 2 CDs, on our first CD, we did a suite of music from Taxi Driver. And on the second one, which was arranged by our trumpet player, Ron Horton, who remains a great friend and is an incredible jazz trumpet player. And on the second recording, we did a suite of music from Once Upon a Time in the West, which was Sergio Leone's epic Western that had an incredible Ennio Morricone score. And that sort of brought full circle this obsession I've had with film music. And though I didn't arrange them, the suite for Once Upon a Time in the West was arranged by the guitarist Pete McCann, who was in the group, who's also another great musician in New York. You know, when we think about the legacies we leave, and especially recordings, because they last forever, yeah, I guess I could say that's something that made me happy to have done that.
When you left college, you came to New York City. Was the focus to be to play jazz, or was it to play any kind of music? Were you was the film scoring, or I know you do screenwriting now, or you've been doing it for a while, but what was your focus right after college?
You know,
or did you not have one?
You know, it's funny you put it that way, but that's a really fair way of asking the question, because I think for a couple of reasons in particular, my focus wasn't very focused. When I first came to New York, I moved here with the trio, with Frank Kimbrough and Lyles West. We moved to the little railroad flat that I'm still in by myself. And I think it was just to play. I didn't really have a plan. And I thought if and when I got married and had kids, that would force the issue. But I don't have kids. And it's been a little easier for me. Boy, it's weird to sort of confess this, but it's been easier for me to coast a little bit more without the pressure of raising kids, to stay a little more of the bohemian, I guess. I don't want to paint the picture of me living in squalor, but I think that enabled me a little more to sort of coast for a while. I had a couple of day jobs that were freelance. I played all kinds of gigs, and in my heart, I wanted to play jazz, but I eventually realized that to be a jazz musician that made a living, as we all know, is one in a million. And when I found myself playing a lot of club dates, weddings and bar mitzvahs and things like that, I thought, oh, this schlep is not what I want to be doing when I'm 40, 50, or 60. So in my case, and it probably applies to a lot of your other guests, I thought, Well, this show thing, which I grew up going to Broadway shows, I love them, but my musical taste sort of evolved into different areas. But what I discovered in high school and college was playing Broadway musicals was kind of tons of fun. You really had to call upon so many different things. And this, right, doesn't this bring us back to what you've discovered with all your guests and what you've lived yourself big time, which is you really have to bring together styles, a certain level of technique, reading music. And in the end, a big part of it is just having done it enough so that you know what the conductor wants and what they expect, and a certain shorthand so that it doesn't take long to get there. So all of that kind of, that along with not having to schlep your drums night after night and do 4 hours in a tuxedo, but doing a show, and I will say also being part of an artistic endeavor and product that in the end could be a really big deal. And it'll even seem that way. Even this sounds so not condescending, but you know, you play dinner theater, you play summer stock, you do community theater, which all of that I did. I just slowly worked my way up the ladder in a very linear, stereotypical way. You get to be surrounded by a huge pool of talent, not just the musicians. And when you're that cog in a big machine, there's a certain level of fulfillment and satisfaction. And the other obvious thing,
I lost
and
you
I
there.
don't,
Oh, I lost you there.
oh,
You said the other obvious thing is
okay. And you might have to cut this. It says my internet connection is unstable, but it should be good. I have a good one, so I don't think this will last.
okay.
We were saying,
The other obvious thing
yeah,
with doing shows.
the other obvious thing though of doing shows is the steady work and knowing that the gig is there. And I don't have to plug the union per se, but thank God for the union, because it enforces and institutionalizes all the things that we really do need to have a career as a musician. The obvious things being pension and welfare, and the less obvious things of making sure there are good work conditions and dealing with a capitalist profit system where certainly the people in charge are going to try to get the most for the least amount of money, and we want to make sure that we are regarded with a certain level of respect. And so all that's been great, but that's a little bit of a tangent. But all of those things made going into the show world in my mind, the best bet to have a career as a musician. And I have done lots of other things. And going back to you asking me about jazz, in my heart, I wanted to play jazz. Playing musicals, it's not even fair to compare them, I think, because it's easy to say that playing a Broadway show is 180 degrees from what it is that's required of you as a musician, as a drummer, than playing, let's say, the most progressive jazz that I was playing, which is to say that your goal, one of the things that's in the front of your mind, not even the back of your mind, that when you're playing a Broadway musical, your job is consistency, to play the exact same thing every night. That doesn't take away from the artistry and the level of musical satisfaction that you should find if you do want to play shows, that you should go for. It is hard to play the same thing every night, but you find that zone where there's satisfaction in tweaking the little things. You never play a perfect show. In my mind, I never do. And I can look, I've even been thinking today of what it is that was less than great last night when I played company, and how I'm going to go for, especially early on in the run, making the conductor happier. But back to my point, and that is there's that skill, and then playing in a jazz group. And I don't know if you found this, and I, I want to engage you more and not hog the conversation too much, but when you go after playing a show for a long time, and then you play a gig where you need to be flexible and you want to express yourself in a much more spontaneous way, that's a tough muscle to sort of reawaken.
Yes,
So when I haven't played jazz for a while, and I've been lucky on the side, especially during the end of COVID, to be playing in a fun little loose trio with bassist Pete Donovan and pianist Frank Ponzio. Very informal, but man, you just want that flowing impulsiveness and all that vocabulary that gets lost when you're playing the same thing every night. It's hard, but if I can sort of walk that tightrope a little bit, that's a fulfilling thing.
What was the first show that brought you to Broadway? Was it Bells Are Ringing, or was it something else? Or
No,
State Fair?
It was well, that was the first show that I was lucky to have the chair for. And that had to do with the relationship that I developed with the conductor at the time, a woman named Kay Cameron, who at that time was much more a woman in a man's world. This was the mid 90s. What had happened was I had never played on Broadway. I think I had watched a couple of people play. I'd watched Howie Joines play the percussion book for
Miss Saigon?
Miss Saigon. No, I'm sorry, Les Mis. I had been playing shows. I had done some tours, lower level bus and truck tours. I had gotten to do a European tour of West Side Story. So I was definitely moving in that direction, but somehow my name got to John Miller when they were looking for a drummer to do the national tour of the Will Rogers Follies. So I was nervous as hell, but I thought I got to dive in sometime. I watched Ray Marchica play the show, which was an interesting experience to hear a guy who back then, around the same age as me, so young guy who was already one of the badasses of Broadway, and to watch him play the show, which the configuration in the pit that time was to literally sit behind him, sort of straddling him. It was a weird, even back then, a tight configuration where the design of the show, this is kind of a interesting aside, which he may or may not have mentioned when he was on your show. There was a passerelle where all the Ziegfeld Follies girls would, I can use that word because it was appropriate in that context, would march in front of the pit. And it was shaped like a rope. And the way they had it, the conductor, the amazingly talented Eric Stern, who was one of the geniuses of Broadway conductors, I think, a very intense guy, but incredible musician, conducted the show at one end of the pit, not from the center. And Ray was right in front of him. It was very tight. He had a spare snare drum that he had on a little, did he talk about this when he was, oh, okay. There was a spare snare drum on a little wooden ledge he built over his head. I don't know if it's because he broke heads regularly. He may or may not have, but I believe it was very soon after I watched him play the show for the first time that the snare fell on his head and split open his forehead. It was a little messy. And I know that Ray's the kind of guy who probably didn't drop a beat, but I sat behind him. I watched him play the show a few times. There was a click, and it's funny because I was listening to you talk about click tracks with Paul Pizzuti, which my experience was similar to his has been, because most of the shows I play are a little more traditional, and we haven't used click very much, at least in my experience, but I've used them. And the first time I played on Broadway was basically an audition for the tour, because John Miller told me, we'd like for you to do the tour, but I think you should sub on the show first. So again, I thought, all right, I got to dive in. It'll be my first time playing on Broadway. I went in. Eric was pretty intense. I had never used a click track before in my life. And the first opening number, which was huge, was on a click. And I was sweating bullets, and everybody's got their version of this story. I played the first act. And oh, by the way, that band was amazing. There were two guitarists and Larry Campbell, who played the great guitarist and pedals. I think he played pedal steel as well. Oh God, help me. I forget who was playing harmonica. There was a harmonica player in the pit. Great orchestrations by Cy Coleman. I'm sorry, by Billy Byers. Cy Coleman wrote the music. And John Miller stuck his head into the pit after Act One to look at Eric Stern like, can this guy play? And I remember seeing Eric give a thumbs up, or actually, yeah, he gave a thumbs up. I got through the show. I wound up subbing about 7 or 8 more times before I went out on the tour. And I'd say, again, this is my long-winded way of answering your question, that was my real introduction to Broadway. I did that. I went on the tour with the conductor, Kay Cameron. We developed a relationship with that, which, as all of us know, is a big part of how drummers get hired. She then hired me for what was the pre-Broadway tour of State Fair, which was the first time a Rodgers and Hammerstein movie musical was turned into a live show. And that went to Broadway, didn't run very long, but that was my first time having my own chair. And as is with many of our gigs, a lot of the short runs, whether we perceive them as stinkers or great shows, because we don't have the same perspective as people in the audience, doesn't matter. Musically, professionally, some of those stinker shows are our best experiences. The band is great. The vibe is great. We love playing the show. State Fair had its issues, but it was a really great band. And that was my first time having my own show.
So State Fair lasted for how long?
Ooh, I want to say 3 or 4 months.
Oh, wow.
What I do remember is it was an okay show. The kind of funny thing was the whole show is about a prize pig that was entered into the Iowa State Fair. And we had a great cast, John Davidson, Andrew McArdle, Bing Crosby's wife, Catherine Crosby, Donna McKechnie, Scott Wise, big cast, 25-piece orchestra, I think, but we had no pig. So they referred to the pig the entire show. And
there's no live pig?
No live pig, which probably would have been a disaster. But it might as well be Spring, a beautiful song, classic Rodgers and Hammerstein music that nobody had heard live in a musical because it had been done as a movie. And we wound up opening up, among our other challenges was, I believe we opened up at the same time, a very celebrated revival of The King and I opened up, which was a story of a few shows I did. And I guess everybody has these career memories where bells are ringing, the second show I did, which also didn't do well for several reasons, even though it was a blast to play. And those were Don Sebesky charts. As an aside, I watched Paul Pizzuti play that revival of Kiss Me, Kate mainly not because I was going to sub, but because Don Sebesky had orchestrated that show. And he quickly, in his brief time orchestrating for Broadway, because he was one of the hippest jazz orchestrators of the 70s and 80s, quickly got a reputation for writing really complex orchestrations that gave every musician a shitload to do. He was told, all right, here's a classic musical like Kiss Me, Kate or Bells Are Ringing. It was written for 30, do it for us for 15. And he would write the shit out of it and then give it to everybody. And at the rehearsals, I mean, the joke was the sound of brass playing Don Sebesky charts was the sound of dropping mutes. And there would be a drummer who had to play percussion. And we've all done that, but Don just wanted to put it all there. And he was a great guy. And at rehearsals, you'd say, Don, I just don't think I can do a triangle roll and a timpani pass and play a shaker at the same time. And he'd just smile and go, just do what you can do, man. But you knew he was the kind of orchestrator who had to just put it on the paper and try it. So I watched Paul play Kiss Me, Kate. It was a little terrifying because he was, and this was before a Billy Miller machine. And as you know, when you're playing a show that has drums and percussion, and you're the person, you're inevitably sticking a triangle beater in your mouth and a slide whistle under your armpit. And I watched him do it, and it just seemed very like, how the hell would I sub on the show? But I wanted to watch him do it because about a month later, I was going to be doing Don Sebesky's arrangements of Bells Are Ringing, which was a great score and just didn't do well, but I had a blast.
I'm going to eventually, I guess maybe I'll ask you right now. You are a film buff, and you probably have a lot of films that you like, that you admire. Have you ever said, you know what, this would be a great Broadway musical?
Oh, that's a fair question to tie in everything here. But honestly, I think my brain probably over the years has gone more to when someone decided that they were going to turn a movie into a musical. And you just wanted to be there at that first meeting and smack them in the face and say, oh, please, please. When you watch this movie, you don't think of the characters breaking out into song. And I'm the first person, having grown up on musicals since I was really young, getting to see some of the greatest when I was a little kid. So I understand the suspension of reality and seeing characters break into song, but I don't think that way, mainly because, this is interesting, because I tried to educate myself with film as best as I could so I can understand things in a cinematic way. And there's so many things that are specifically cinematic that have very little to do with live stage anything, not just musicals. So they're just two different. I think basically what I'm saying here is I was much more aware of what made those two art forms, live theater and film, two distinct art forms for very specific reasons. You get beyond entertainment and whether it's meant to be the documentation of a real life or a made up fairy tale. But beyond that, they're just two different art forms. So my brain would rarely ever go to, I'm sorry, I don't have I'm sure when we're finished, I'll think of, oh yeah, one time I thought this would make a great musical. And actually,
let me ask you a question before
sure.
you go on. I'm just going to throw one out there. Would it be a hit or a miss? Taxi Driver, the musical.
If someone was really clever, it would be a hysterical comedy. If someone was, you know what, and by the way, you can cut this out, but let me know if my answers are like insanely long-winded, because I know you're talking to people who I'm guessing for the most part love to yap, but I become very not conscious of it if I'm droning on. That's but your question, which was, hit or miss, Taxi Driver the musical. I had something poignant to say there.
Sometimes I used to do this on Facebook a lot. It's like, man, because one of my favorite like cult classics is The Warriors. I don't know why I like it, even though it's a bad movie, but just says something about New York City, 1979, which I found mysterious. And I got here, and I'm like, ugh, I wouldn't want to have lived back then, but I think the gangs are cool. The. But anyway, The Warriors, the musical. I couldn't imagine all of a sudden the gangs all of a sudden breaking out in song. But then I started thinking about all the stuff that they put together in these art Broadway shows. I'm like, Carrie the musical, and it's like, wait a minute, I better stop giving out these ideas, because The Warriors the musical could either be really funny or really really stupid. But
Right.
Taxi Driver the musical.
Well, here's the thing. And you know what? That's a really good question to ask for a few reasons. One being that we think about things in terms of commercialism and which things were hits. But the truth is, if you have the right artists behind something, the sky should be the limit. It's art, and it should always never be held back by someone thinking it's a silly idea, because it all has to do with who wrote it. And it's funny you should mention that, because there was a big article in the New York Times just today about West Side Story, and about people, reviewers and artists talking about how relevant it is today, and how dated and unwoke it is because the movie's coming out. And yes, that's the perfect illustration of talking about, do you want to see a bunch of kids in a gang singing and dancing? And the truth is, it's a hard show to pull off for that reason. But in its purest form, without a doubt, that music is arguably the greatest, as far as I'm concerned, the greatest music ever written for a musical. I hate to say the greatest anything, but in my mind, when I was a kid, so seeing a high school production of it, it really grabs you. And that's really a testament, not to the idea of saying, let's do Romeo and Juliet, which is a very romantic story on top of it being a very violent story, and set it to music and dance and modernize it.
Oh, before you even go on there,
Sure.
I'm sorry, I don't want to.
No, it's okay.
You. In 2013, I went to San Diego and played a show called The Last Goodbye, and it was it was Romeo and Juliet done to Jeff Buckley music. So it was the classic story done to something that was relatively modern.
Right.
Didn't go any further than that, but it was interesting. It was dark, it was violent, but the music was great, and they needed to work on some stuff, but people had an idea and they just made it happen. So anyway,
those are all good things that are actually even making me think right now, which is that I am the first person, I might not say it out loud, but when I hear someone says, they're doing a musical about King Kong, or they're doing a musical about Spider-Man, and you want to go, oh, really? Please. And yet you just stop for a second and you think, if it really is true that the sky should be the limit, yes, if you did a musical about the Jets and the Sharks, and you had the right composer, and let's face it, Bernstein really does stick out amongst other Broadway composers who might have been amazing, or who are amazing, but brought something to it that made you think it's possible. So I think what we might want to say here is that, as much as history might show that a lot of these are dopey ideas because of what might drive creative people to make a successful Broadway musical that will make money, because the capitalism will always play into this, and knowing that that's a big part of it, you should never quash the sky's the limit concept. And I guess all I have to say is Hamilton, a show that I've never seen. I may or may not like because I'm not super in sync with hip hop music, and uh, I I can't comment on it as much as I know a lot of the creative people involved. But let's face it, that was not motivated by commercial um, possibilities as much as a talented up and coming star, Lin-Manuel Miranda, thought, I love this story. I'm setting it to music. And if he explained it to somebody who didn't know who he was, they would roll their eyes. And clearly, across the board, people have found it artistically, not just commercially, but artistically, a really important piece.
So um your entrance into the Broadway sphere or community started with uh State Fair, then another short one with Bells Are Ringing. You eventually did speaking, I think it was a uh again, I'm it's funny. I'm going to back up a little bit. I really don't know much about Broadway movie musicals, and I'm learning as I go. And I don't even know much about Broadway, and I'm learning as I go. 20 years in, I'm still learning who the famous composers of the 40s and 50s and 60s were.
Right.
And a little short story, which I've told a number of times on the podcast, is that when I was doing a show called Tick Tick Boom back in 2001, Jonathan Larson would always talk about.
I'm going to interrupt. Did you do that? I saw Jonathan Larson perform those tunes at the Village Gate.
Oh, really? No,
Does that? Okay.
I didn't do that. No.
There may not have even been drums in that, but go ahead. Yeah.
I think there was. I don't know who was on, doing that back then. I was trying to be a rock star back in the 90s. But
well, we all are at some level, metaphorically and or literally. But yeah, go ahead.
In 2001, when I did Tick Tick Boom, he was always talking about Stephen Sondheim, and at the end of the show, there's a voice message from Stephen Sondheim. So during rehearsals, I think I asked Stephen or Remus, I was like, "Who the hell is Stephen Sondheim?" He was like, "Shh."
Right. Don't say that out loud. At least around theater people. Yeah.
Exactly. It's like being in a jazz club. Miles Davis. Who's that?
Yeah.
So I learned who he was, and so I'm going back over a lot of. I didn't really even know who Audra McDonald was when I got that gig playing with her. I was like, my girlfriend was like, "Oh my God, you with Audra McDonald? She's about to win her 6th Tony Award and blank, blank, blank." I'm like, okay, let me play some jazz. But anyway.
And by the way, you sound fantastic. I as you may know, I played a little bit of What a Little Moonlight Can Do.
Yes.
With the trio and Audra singing her, I almost want to say bizarrely incredible impression, because that's not her voice normally. And I was telling George Farmer how the rhythm section not only was swinging and great, and how great you all sounded, but how particularly appropriate was for that particular time and place that you were trying to recreate, which partly because of my movie music obsession, I'm obsessive about. So I'm just saying as an aside, you guys had a great groove that you copped on that. Anyway, that was the Audra McDonald thing, but go ahead.
Yeah. So just to let everybody know, Rich has a great podcast called Big Noise from Planet Earth. Definitely check it out. George Farmer is on one of the episodes, and they were talking about our approach to the music for the show Lady Day at Emerson's Bar and Grill.
Right.
And how we actually really did sit there in the dressing room and listen to albums from 1959, and he wanted me to hear certain musicians and just immerse ourselves in that period. So we weren't trying to sound like Elvin Jones and and Ron Carter, and that was way past.
That was not what that was about. Right. No, it just, well, let me ask you this, to your point. do you not find, and by the way, not knowing who someone is, we're all going to experience that several times throughout our lives, because even especially when we think we know everything or we think we've been around, someone's going to say, do you know so-and-so? And you say no. And we're going to find out that that feels embarrassing afterwards. So we all should experience that, because
that's how you learn.
Yeah. But even more importantly, have you not found, as you've evolved through your world in Broadway, that it's one of the things that I find most enjoyable is copying a style and something that's appropriate to that era, which is not always that easy for Broadway, because Broadway can sort of make things sound a little generically Broadway. But if you can bring something, and yeah, on Lady Day at Emerson's Bar and Grill, you guys were a perfect example of like, all right, whether people in the audience know it or not, you're bringing them to a time and place, and you work specifically on that style. That's a really good point that you made, that George said the same thing. You can't just play, even if you're just playing a simple tune with brushes, you can't play it like Elvin.
Right. So with other shows that I've done too, you have to immerse yourself in whatever era music that you're going to be trying to emulate. And you want to try to make it as authentic as possible. Even when we did Ain't Too Proud, we're trying to emulate the Funk Brothers, and we're trying, one of the better and most interesting compliments I got was from this guy named Aaron Spears. He's a drummer that played with Usher and a bunch of other people. He was in the audience one afternoon, and we got done, and I saw an inbox, a direct message on Instagram. It says, "Oh man, you sound great. You guys sound so authentic, man. Just here's my number and hit me up whenever you want." I'm like,
feels good, huh?
It's like, wow, this dude is actually listening. So yeah, it's really, it feels good to get compliments from people that you look up to, saying that you sound right for that show, which is important to know the history of what you're doing, and also knowing some of the background of what you're trying to do, because sometimes you're going to have to reach into that vocabulary, as we talked about before, and
right.
bring it to the show. So which brings me back to not knowing who Stephen Sondheim was, which watching the movie of Tick Tick Boom, which my girlfriend and I watched 2 nights ago, seeing how much of an influence he was to Jonathan Larson, which he influenced Lin-Manuel Miranda, and who I'm sure Lin is going to influence a whole bunch of new people. But knowing where it all comes from, I think it matters. It makes a big difference. So going back to the movie buff thing,
Right.
and musicals, Irving Berlin's White Christmas.
Okay, that's a good one to bring up, because, and this would be almost in spite of the material. Now, I had never seen, as classic as it I'd never seen White Christmas. I was thrilled to do that, as I was with any Broadway show, being asked to do that. And I did that one because Rob Berman, conductor and good friend, one of my favorite people on the planet, asked me to do it. It was a limited run, and he said White Christmas, and in my mind I went, all right, classic music. I like playing classic music, but my expectations to really play drums and hit drums always are limited. And I give it up when I do a Broadway show. It's like, I know I'm not going to really play drums in the most expressive way that I could, but I have always tried to shift gears, and in my mind, and this goes to what you were saying before, have fun with the little things and the stylistic things, but you're a small cog in a huge machine, and you have to get that satisfaction in a smaller way. Now, as far as White Christmas was concerned, they had recorded a cast. They had been touring that show for a while before it made it to Broadway, and there was a London cast recording. And yeah, I knew most of the tunes, not because I had seen the movie, but because Irving Berlin, like 90% of his tunes are part of our, you know, conscious, our collective conscious. Uh, and I heard those charts and I kind of went like, what the fuck? This is all big band stuff. And I got on that band. I was lucky in that I did the first year of the 2 years they did it. And there were 24 pieces. So there was a decent string section. And I loved playing with bassist Lou Bruno, and we got to play big band charts. I would say that more than any other musical I've done felt the closest to playing in a big band. And I will credit that to Doug Besterman and Larry Blank, who, as they have in other shows, co-orchestrated that. I don't know how much instruction they got, because you always have to go by choreographers and what the expectations are of the creative team. But they really went for it. And those were big band charts that were a blast to play. Interestingly, almost a companion piece to that was, because it was the prequel to that movie in a way. Now I can't think of the show, and it's the one I did a few years ago, the Bing Crosby, Fred Astaire musical, Holiday Inn, which actually introduced the song White Christmas. I got to do a production of that. And Larry Blank also orchestrated that, but because of whatever the creative input was from the main creative people, it wasn't as much of a big band type show. And of course that must have to do with the book of the show and the action, what's happening. But White Christmas was a particularly fun show to do because I got to kick a big band more than any other show I've done. It was, and you can find out by talking to drummers around the world, because they've toured that show so much. And if they've done it with 14 pieces as opposed to 24, they'll still talk about that as being a fun show to play.
Tell me about Finnegan's Rainbow. Again, that was a movie too, correct?
Yeah, it's funny you should pick that, because I mean, I got to do that as part of the Encores, which I will say without hesitation is the best musical theater gig on the planet for a few particular reasons. One is you're on stage and you feel like you're a bigger part of the show because people are visual and they're much more conscious of the orchestra. You always play the original orchestrations, which means you're on stage with an average of 30 musicians. And you are on stage being conducted by Rob Berman, who is absolutely the best. Now, I've done, I don't know, 20 some odd of those. And Finnegan's Rainbow was kind of special in that it really illustrated a very sweet old-fashioned musical, particularly dated. And I comfortably will say dated about shows. And it doesn't have to be pejorative at all. I think people should see things in the context of when they were out. And as you know, it dealt with race relations in a very, I don't want to say it was forward thinking, because Broadway is rarely forward thinking, but it still might illustrate a certain liberal mindset at the time. Of course it does, but it's certainly quaint and clumsy now. But having said that, controversies as to whether or not to do something unless it's really inappropriate should always be, it was a Broadway classic. It has its charm. You go see it, and afterwards, if you talk about it, you talk about why is this kind of dopey, and why are these race relations that they're dealing with clumsy now. But Finnegan's Rainbow was special when I did it, because it was maybe the best example of what the Encores meant to me, which was I grew up listening to a lot of these classic records. And, it's funny, you say you didn't know a lot about Broadway. It was kind of forced on me when I was a little kid. My parents even took me to see Ethel Merman in a production of Annie Get Your Gun when I was a little kid. Probably scarred for life from that. But all these tunes were things that I heard over and over again. And when I got to do the encores, I was getting to do those exact charts that the original musicians did. So as much as a lot of the standards that I wound up playing in musicals over my life, I really knew those tunes because I heard Sinatra sing them, or I heard Train play them, or Miles play them. I'm getting to play them in their original form and with a really great orchestra. And that is a singular thrill for doing the encores for me, which is what it should be, because that's the whole point of the encores, is let's recreate it so that people now can see a semblance of what it was like to see Finnegan's Rainbow in, that would have been the mid-late 40s.
47, I think.
Yeah. And it was weird. One of the luckiest moments in my life was they later decided to transfer that to Broadway. And at the time, I wound up being asked to do 2 other Broadway musicals. All I could think of to this day is all the other drummers thinking, Rich Rosenzweig, he's got to choose between 3 shows.
Which 3 were they?
Maybe it's egotistical for me to even think that any other drummer was even thinking of me, but knowing how competitive it is, I lucked out. I was asked to do that revival of Ragtime with also a great conductor and friend of mine, Jim Moore, and also a revival of Bye Bye Birdie, which I did a workshop of, which Paul Pizzuti wound up playing, which is also great tunes. We did a workshop with Charles Strauss there, the composer. And I had to choose between 3 of them. It was kind of bizarre for me to luck out, but it was just the timing. And Bye Bye Birdie was technically going to be a limited run because I think it was roundabout. And it was timing in a way that just wound up having me choose Ragtime instead of Finnegan's Rainbow. And none of those shows ran for more than a few months. So it wouldn't have mattered. I don't regret the decision I made, but Finnegan's Rainbow, I saw it when they transferred it to Broadway. Billy Miller played the drum percussion book. And I will say that that's maybe the best example of a show that is unabashedly sweet and corny, and I enjoyed every minute of it.
So Finnegan's Rainbow didn't run long, then you went over to Ragtime?
No. I chose Ragtime, so I did the 1 week encores version, which was almost this exact same thing, other than it was fully staged when they brought it to Broadway. Same leads. They shrunk the size of the orchestra, I think, for Broadway. But I made it a point, I might have even taken off from Ragtime just to see it, because I kind of wanted to see it. It was a great example of, hey, here's a show that my parents always spoke about. They saw when they were younger. And I wanted to see it from the audience, which is not usually the case. I don't see many musicals.
Yeah, I've asked that question to a bunch of people. Do you see the musicals that you're in, and do you do that or do you not do that?
And
why?
I would say, yeah, I know. You think that's a quick, easy yes or no answer. I have. I was going to ask what you found in general with drummers, whether they just go to musicals in general. And I always feel like it. Yeah. What have you found? What's
the only one that I know that does that regularly is Larry Lelly. Larry sees a lot of musicals just to know what's out there and what trends are,
right,
where the trends are.
No, that's interesting. Sorry, I don't want to cut you off.
But I I have done that. I just, you know, I have to have the money to do that. But if there's a,
Right.
if
Hey,
there's a
that's
chance at the beginning of your show that you're doing, and the company might have you go to another show that's either just opening at the same time, that's when we get the opportunity to see other people perform. It's always good to see your colleagues perform, and when before I did Ain't Too Proud, I knew I had a show coming in, so I'd go check out other drummers and see what they did in their pits. But I like seeing the shows that I do for a couple of reasons, I guess. One, I want to see what it sounds like, but also want
hmm
to see what this show is to know. I mean, when you're playing a show and you're originating the show, you're in the rehearsal room and you're working with the conductor and you're working with the choreographer, and you're the one that's coming up in conjunction with the choreographer with the hits or whatever. And of course, the dance arranger might also give you some instruction as to what to play also. But when you're watching it from the audience, you can see why they're kicking their legs up or where and what is being triggered when you play a certain drum hit. So, and then you get to see the entire picture, and you
Yeah.
understand why you're doing
Well, let
what
me
you're
ask
doing.
you this. It's funny you mentioned that. Have you been surprised? You think you're in the room with piano and you're watching all this stuff evolve, and yeah, you see it over and over again, and people think, oh, you already know exactly what the show looks like. And without fail, when you see it from the audience, you never really put it together so that you had a clear image of what it was what you just saw when you go to see it from the audience. And I'm almost always pleasantly surprised at what it looks like, how it um, meshes with the music. You play it night after night, and I say this as someone who doesn't go to musicals much for all the reasons you were talking about. It's expensive. Um, I feel like when I have the list of things that I need to do when I have a night off, going to a Broadway show is usually not on the list. And another point that I'm sure you were going to come to, and which you're also making, which is I've taken off. Yes, I've taken off to see the shows that I was playing. And this is, I guess it gets out into the public, but I have a feeling other guests of yours who are all very forthcoming confess that I think it's okay to say this, and sound people will not be crushed.
Right.
Because this is a psychological thing, not just an artistic thing. And that is when you're sitting in the middle of that sound, and yes, our egos are saying the band is the most important thing. Okay, there are singers, but you hear every little nuance of that orchestration, not even selfishly as a drummer, if you want to hear everything with the drums, but you hear all of that. And then you're reminded, no, you're there to serve the singers. And on top of that, no, it can't sound like a record, the records you hear, or the other live performances you hear, because you really need to hear those lyrics.
Right.
It's one thing if you can buy a record and figure out the lyrics, but it's all about how it all goes to with the band and the musicians, and it might be a dance record or whatever it is. You have a show, not only is it the composer, if they're alive, they want you to hear those lyrics, but those lyrics have to drive
The story.
the narrative. So you go out. The best example of this, which is a sound problem, and please forgive me, whoever was running the sound, but I did a recurring, actually it was fixed, so there's a slightly happy ending to this, but I played a recurring production of The Wizard of Oz at Madison Square Garden, or as Paul Pizzuti referred to it the other day, the Felt Forum, which we were past the Felt Forum stage. This was called the Theater at Madison Square Garden. They were trying to do a spring commercial success on the back of A Christmas Carol there, because it's a 5,000 seat auditorium. So we did a production of The Wizard of Oz, and it was meant to be a live. I keep doing musicals that are live musicals that were started out as movies. And they really wanted to, a huge theater, they wanted to give people a live version of that movie, which is so iconic. And we were only 20 pieces, which you and I would think it's a 5,000 seat auditorium, you know, man up, go for it. Have a 50-piece orchestra is what we would really love, but okay. But 20 pieces, they built a pit because there was no pit. So we were on the floor in front of the stage. Huge visual experience. And I remember I thought, well, I want to see this from the audience, see if it's a big enough spectacle. And the first year, I sat out in what arguably would be a great seat, and I didn't know the orchestra had started. That's how quiet it was. So for me,
Wow.
I mean, the overture, did I say the overture? Yeah.
Wow.
And that's, you don't have to support any singing. So I would have thought, crank it up. It's the overture. It's what people hear in the movie. There's an overture over the credits, the beginning credits. So that's the extreme illustration of having to face the fact that as much as it's called a Broadway musical, that the music is not going to be as much in the forefront as you would think in your mind. And be prepared when you go hear a show, especially one that you're the regular musician with, and be prepared to, as we've all experienced, to not hear all of the things you've worked hard on for nuances. Not that they don't count, because first and foremost, you do it for yourself as a musician and for the musicians around you, because that's what making great music is about. And yes, it still translates to the audience at a certain level, just the way Freddie Green's guitar, you almost can't hear, but it's a huge part of that bassy rhythm section. So don't ever take the nuances for granted. But when you're out in the audience, not only do you not hear it, this is interesting, but your attention is, especially since you've seen the show, but you've seen it from where you're playing drums, wherever, you're taken by what you're seeing and the performances, which have so much more depth than you think when you hear it every night, but don't see it. So you got to give it up. Whatever your artistic, not snobbery, but intensity is, that when you're in that audience, suddenly that rim shot at mezzo forte doesn't, you might not be aware of it, even though you're listening to your sub play it and you're all ready for it because you work so hard to make it work. It's all part of the show.
The 4 shows that I've seen from the audience when I did Memphis the Musical, I was excited. I was overjoyed. I was like, this is so good. I mean, we won the Tony Award that year. I mean, it was a really good show. It ran for a long time. Then what did I do after that? It was Lady Day. Yeah, when I didn't get a chance to see Lady Day because I was in the show, and I'm not gonna. I
Hard
wish
to
I
sub
had.
out, right? Did you sub out at all for Lady
No,
Day?
I subbed out, which, looking back, I was like, why did I sub out that show? It was so good. But, to do club dates and to do the other things, just like you talked about before, if you're doing the same thing over and over again, you lose the vocabulary to play other things. So it's important to get out there and do that. And then, why am I blanking? The shows that Ain't Too Proud.
Well, part of it could be COVID brain fog. And look, if you've been lucky enough and you've had a string of pretty successful productions, it's understandable.
But watching the shows that I've done, I was, when a show was really good, there's a lot of emotion that goes into it, and I'm kind of a softy inside when it comes to certain things. And watching Audra play Billie Holiday, look, I know how the show ends. I've done it a million times, but seeing her do it, I was like, oh my God, she's
got to you, huh?
I was sitting there on my couch watching HBO. I was like, "Oh my god, this is." Then watching the Temptations. Yes, they all die at the end. I'm sorry.
Whoa, whoa, you're killing me here. What? The Temptations all die at the end, all in like a bus accident? What are you talking about?
Yeah, well,
Uh,
I won't give it away, but
oh my God.
I know. I'm
Ball of
sorry.
confusion, man. Damn.
Yeah, but I was. There's a lot of emotion in that show. Our shows that there's a lot of ups and downs in that show, and so watching it from the audience, it definitely gives you a different perspective. And you said a lot of other things that are very pertinent, like the little things that you do that you think that won't matter, but they do matter. So
They do. And I think, yeah, just to repeat, when you're in the audience, it's a combination of, all right, it would be nice to hear every nuance because especially you think that the technology should allow it. You can hear a great live concert, Broadway's state of the art. Why can't I hear every little nuance? Once in a while, you do. Uh, but you got to get over that. And you also will find yourself, I don't know, I mean, you sort of said this, that you almost find yourself at the end going, well, I wasn't paying attention to the drumming because I was wrapped up in the story of Billie Holiday dying, or so it's too, there are too many facets involved with a Broadway show to get hung up on certain things, even though it's okay to admit that you were hung up, because as musicians, you have to be obsessive about it. You have to, we give it up to the real grumpy musicians who might put too fine a point on certain aesthetic things, because we've all learned early on to be a good musician. We have to have a certain level of obsession, right? I mean, if you're cavalier and casual about how you sound, that's why every night, man, I know I'm not giving 100% every night, but for the most part, you're being obsessive about it. And if you fuck up little things, it sits with you, and nobody else wants to hear you moan about, oh, I didn't sound too good tonight. Oh, really? You sounded the way you always do. We're all obsessive about it. It's natural. If you weren't, or if you don't sound that way when you talk to other people, you're either keeping it to yourself, or you have some sort of Zen way of looking at it, or you're a liar, because you can't get, I mean, if there's any, because now that I'm past 60, anything sage that I'm bringing to this table of yours, which is a very cool thing to preserve here, it's that that obsession is what drives us, and you have to not let it break you down in terms of getting too down on yourself, but you have to allow that level of obsession, I think, to, it's what serves you well in a lot of ways.
yeah, last night when I was playing my show, I don't know when the last time I dropped a stick was, but man, I dropped my stick like 3 times. I'm like, what is going on back here? And I was like, no, I can't do this. I can't drop my stick because
What do you think it was?
I have no idea. Well, I'm kind of switching sticks, so that might have been an issue. I'm trying to find, I've talked about this before, but trying to find, having the right equipment matters because you're going to be playing the show 8 times a week,
Right.
hopefully for years. You don't want to hurt your hands because your hands matter. So playing a stick that's too thin, too heavy, the wrong kind of wood, the wrong kind of beater, the wrong kind of taper, you got to get it right. So Carl Latham came in. He was watching me because he's going to be subbing soon, and he brought a new pair of sticks. I was like, oh, let me try these, and I liked them. So I was playing with them, but then I put them away, and I went back to my old sticks, and then they didn't feel right. So I was fumbling with them. So again, trying to play the right show is
Right.
perfect. Is as perfect as I can get it. I realized I wasn't doing it right, so I got rid of those sticks and brought Carl sticks back. So I was playing, and I finished the show, and I think I aced the test.
Ah, but I know why you would have dropped them, and it wasn't because of something physical that probably happened. It's just more than other situations when you do the same thing every night. The um, the skill becomes being in the right frame of mind to just be relaxed and do the show. And what I'm saying here is that uh, if you do something repetitive every night, if there's something that throws off your brain, it could be in the recesses, something in your brain just made you think about the sticks, I think. And, that issue, because let's face it, if we were well, I shouldn't say if we were super relaxed, we would never drop the sticks. Physically, we know that the drummers we love who seem to have the most relaxed grip in the world will drop their sticks. But I just know, at least I'm projecting onto you, man, but that's one thing we also can all do, because at a certain level, we're all doing something really similar. We're bringing our own personalities, but being a Broadway drummer, like how I wrap this all back into the theme of your show, that, what's very cool about doing the show is you have all these different personalities, and whatever their histories are, whatever the similarities are, but more interestingly, the differences. But in the end, we're all doing something very singular. And so when you're playing night after night, I find personally concentration, a certain type of concentration, is what it winds up being all about from night to night. Why I have a less than great show. I might even make more mistakes, or not more mistakes, but I never have a perfect show. But if I was relaxed, and what my brain in a relaxed manner told my body to play, if that flow was smooth, at the end of the show, I'm happy. It's like, all right, it was a perfect show, but it felt good. It just felt relaxed. If something is making me uptight, it could be something overt, something that happened during the day, or just something that's sitting there in the back of my mind. I could play sonically the same show. Every other musician would sound like the exact same show, and I wouldn't feel as good afterwards. Does that make sense? Do you know what I'm saying? Especially when you're doing something night after night, where it's the minutia that changes the experience. Let's face it, we're going for doing it the exact same way, but the conductor feels slightly differently. In this case, I'm wearing headphones because I'm remoted from a booth, which is the first time I think I've done this on Broadway. And I have the great Michael Blanco's bass playing in my ear, and it's clear and it's amazing. But, there are those little things at play that might throw you off. I'm not saying Michael's throwing me off. I'm saying things in the recesses of your mind. It's an interesting experience playing Broadway musicals night after night. And I remember hearing you talk about struggling with, and you're a youngster compared to a lot of the people you're interviewing, and you struggle with, like, God, how long can I do this? And it's not, there's nothing against playing shows. I mean, let's face it, the other theme you've been dealing with is how a whole generation is growing up where they want to be a Broadway musician, as opposed to 50 years ago and before. It wasn't bad to be a Broadway musician, but it wasn't at the top of your list because you had to put up with playing the same thing every night. And now that's a skill, a psychological skill that you have to bring to the table. So now there's a whole generation who wants to do that. And I defy anybody, including the most enthusiastic 30-year-olds, if they're lucky and they get on a show, after year one, that skill is not so much you're a drummer. Oh, that's not the right way to put it. But a lot of your efforts are the right frame of mind, the right attitude, so that you go, hey, am I going to do this for another 5 years? Maybe. Am I going to worry about it until I decide I want to quit? You got to bring it, right?
It was interesting to hear Paul talk about his tenure at Cats. He said, "I got about 5 years of this in me." And he said about year 7, I was like,
Yeah.
"Wow." Talking to the first podcast I had was with Bill Lanham, and he was talking about how the Phantom Orchestra opened up, I think, a year before Les Mis or a year after Les Mis. I can't remember which one it was. And they're still running. And he wondered, man, would he still be doing Les Mis if it was still running on Broadway 30 years later? And I wonder myself, will I stay? Well, put it like this. I'm not staying at Ain't Too Proud for 30 years. I'm just putting it out there. I'm not doing that because I'm not staying in New York for 30 years. I'm not staying in New York for 10. Hopefully, New York, hopefully Ain't Too Proud will run for at least, I don't, hope it runs as long as Les Mis and Cats and Phantom. But I won't be there.
Okay, but I know you're being a little hyperbolic, but 2 years from now,
Yes.
5 years from now.
The goal is to get out of here when my son graduates high school.
Oh, okay. See, now that's good. Have specific. No, it sounds funny, but it's true. If you're able to have really practical goals that work for you, that's great, and that's a cool one to have. I think a lot of guys in my position now, the phrase, this is the show that's going to take me to the end, not to when you die, but it's like,
Right.
all right, to the
Right.
point where you're thinking about, and that sounds, that sounds harsh for me to say, because I'm not 85 or 90. And I want to think that, like any musician, you're not giving up on your instrument. And as drummers, it's a little easier than, say, a trumpet player, to say that I don't want to give up my instrument because people are afraid to tell me, dude, you kind of should give up your instrument because you can't play anymore, or you're not sounding good enough, because some of us might be deluded and it just feels good to play. But you know what I'm saying? It's that,
Right.
In some sense, the energy it takes to play a Broadway show. And let's be specific. There are musicians who still want to keep playing, can still play their butts off, but at a certain age, they're just tired of just playing a Broadway show.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I kind of want to go a little bit on the wisdom of a good friend of mine, Ron Jannelli, one of the great doublers on Broadway, who's in his early 80s now and sort of retired. And a big part of that is one of his specialties is being an excellent bassoonist. And he was a first call player, not for just shows, but he lived in LA for 20 years and did a lot of film and TV. And that's a lot of instruments to schlep around when you're a Broadway player, because you got bassoon and whatever other woodwinds you've got. And he was a very busy guy, but we did a couple of shows together and would drive together if we were taking trips upstate, because we both have places up there. And he said, I'm doing this now, and he was in his 70s, because I love the hang. I just want to be around musicians. And he stuck it out. And for various reasons, he's sort of given it up. And the sad thing is, and we don't know what the future will bring, but the sad thing is that you might be ready to give up Broadway for all reasonable excuses. It's time to, like, because after a while, you don't want to just barely be making 50% because you just barely want the gig. So you think, all right, for good reason, this is my last show. And financially, going back to what I was trying to say before, you think, all right, maybe the show will carry me for a little while. But if you do give up Broadway and you're still a good player who can contribute, you just have to hope that you find that outlet and that you're able to do it not once a year.
Right. Yeah.
uh,
Starting to make me think. Well, I already know what I want to do. I have several other interests outside of playing drums.
yeah, I was going to ask.
Well, this being one of them. I love talking to people, and I love sharing the things that I've learned over 21 years of playing shows with people that want to do what we do. And I love talking to people. I like to get to just like hearing other people's perspective and just adding to the conversation and giving back. I also like
And it's a
writing.
great record too, by the way. Your skills interviewing other drummers for posterity,
Yes.
it's certainly a form of the annals of whatever it is we do, and there's a lot of validity to that.
I'm hoping this will. I have many other ideas for this as well. Things are brewing in my subconscious, but for myself, I've just I think about how long I've been in New York City. Yeah, I know people have been here all their lives. I moved here in 1993. It's going to be 29 years, half my life. And
Yeah,
we talked about travel on our phone conversation before. It's a whole other tangent that we can go on or
right.
off.
Right. Well,
But
it's partly part of our career and a big part of that, and also partly, an important thing for just living life.
yes, when I travel, I notice that there are places that are more in line with my uh I can't think of the right word, constitution, my wavelength, my aura, my vibration.
Right.
In New
Your
York City,
quality of life, if I may
yes.
interrupt, which is a thing that every New Yorker, no, not every, most New Yorkers will struggle with because of the sacrifices we make, whether they're valid or not, for the quality of life that, sorry to interrupt you, but when you travel, a lot of cities, it's like it's a much better quality of life. And we think, well, we put up with the shit because it's New York. And that definition has changed. So it's a thing we wrestle with. Anyway, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm tired of wrestling. I'm no longer wanting to be on the mat.
Well put. Yeah.
So I've decided to make changes. Excuse me. I've decided to make changes in my life to make this go round a lot easier. Like I have a Broadway show. I'm very, very, very thankful that I have this opportunity to play music, to make people happy, and to make a living at this. But I'm not doing what I did before. Just like I'm not dragging drums around playing on Bleecker Street anymore. I'm just not going to do it because I don't want to do it. I've done it for 28 years. I'm not doing it anymore. So I'm willing to cut certain things out in order to make it easier for me to live a daily life without. And I tell people this: I don't want to walk out of my apartment, in my beautiful sunny apartment, and have to ball up my fists in order to go to work.
Right.
And fight my way through the subway and noise and sound like the guy from the Grinch. Noise, noise, noise.
No, it is so true. And it's good to hear people admit that out loud, because sometimes we've been afraid to diss New York. And as artists, diss any of these things that were all a part of our aspirations when you were young. And I lived the quintessential bohemian life, and all of that was kind of cool. But yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And also, it is also fair to say that it's not just the nature of getting older, but the times are not always the same.
Right.
It's a different world, and what we can expect out of having a career as a musician is not necessarily bad. And I would be the last person to discourage anybody under the age of 40, because they're the ones that will make something happen that could be a total surprise and amazing. Because the talent pool, let's face it, you just go on YouTube and it's insane. They're all still out there, maybe even more so than before. However, we don't know what to expect. you get to a certain age, and I think it's okay to admit that you're still an artist in your heart. You still want to do what you can, but you have to combine that with what your real life and living situation is like. And New York City is a tough place to be. And it's okay to say, I love everything that's great about New York, but the stuff that's tough, you don't want to be in denial. You want to have a certain quality of life. Doesn't mean being wealthy. It just means, just like you, I like my apartment, but the time I leave my apartment to the time I get to that stage door, it's very hard not to be overwhelmed by the masses of humanity, the harshness of city life. Nothing against people as individuals, but as a tourist, crowded, unpleasant situation, it's not cool. And then I get to into the stage door and I go, I got a Broadway show right now. I'm so grateful, but I will ride this as long as I can. I'm honored to play this music, to play with these people. It's been particularly heavy because of Sondheim's passing. And by the way, it's Stephen Sondheim. He was this composer. And no, sorry.
Who?
Yeah. Anyway, I'm sorry to get all like universal, but you were making good points, and I think it's good to be honest.
Well, it's interesting thing is people that know me, especially stuff that I posted on social media, which I don't do anymore. I mean, I post certain things on social media, but not my opinion as much.
Yeah, that's can of worms, man.
Yeah, exactly. But people know how I feel about New York City. They're like, well, you should get out of here and go someplace else. Well, I will. I am, and I realize there's place. Look, I'm just putting these places out there. I don't know if I want to live there, especially with the way things are in 2021.
Mm-hmm.
I love Northern California. I love San Diego. I went down to Austin. It's beautiful there. I don't think I'd want to live in Florida, but Miami's cool. There are places in the Midwest that I'd like to go to. I'd like to see. I've never been to Hawaii. Yes, it's so expensive. Yeah, but so is New York.
Right. You know what, Clayton, you and I and everybody else that's had the privilege, I will use that word, to do any kind of touring, especially show touring where you sit in the city for at least a week or more. There's this dichotomy that we have to deal with, which is, I'm pausing because I'm hoping you can't hear my noisy radiator, you can hear it.
It's the rudiments that it's playing.
Yeah, exactly. And part of, hey,
I'm in New York City living.
Exactly. The thing that messes you up about travel, obviously it's a great thing. And it sounds like you and I and most people who do it wouldn't have given it up for the world, but it shows you what the options are out there. It shows you that it's like, especially the coolest things are when you're in some town that you had low expectations for. You're there for a week or two, and that last weekend where you have a breather or you're whatever, and you go, holy shit, this is a cool place. So you suddenly realize all the other lives that are potential out there for you in a way, and the choices you have. And in a bizarre way, if all you know is your one town and you're closed off to it, it makes life easier because you've already decided, and you either are oblivious to your other choices or you're stubborn about New York is the greatest place in the world. And look, I grew up in the burbs. I'm a New Yorker through and through. My grandparents were all here. I just basically, fair enough to say I'm a New Yorker through and through, and get everything that's cool about it. Nothing taking away from that, but no shame in admitting that it's harder life. And when you're trying to look forward, it's good to be open-minded, even if like, it sounds like you, but a lot of other people, even if you can't put your finger on what it is you want to where you want to move to, and what it is you want specifically. And what you do, what you're talking about doing, is something that you certainly do not have to be in New York to do.
That's correct. You know, on another podcast that I had during the pandemic, it was it's called Think Things Through, and I would talk to people. Well, I would talk to a couple of people, but I would write about what was going on, and I decided not to do that either because there's so much negativity that was going on, and that still is, but I choose to focus on this now. But I was talking to this guy. His name is Josh Blumenthal. He was a friend of mine through our efforts in changing the domestic relations law here in New York State. He's Jewish, and I asked him about Jews and the history of Jewish people. And one of the things he was telling me is that, Jews kept getting pushed out of where they were living. They would always have to change locations. And he said they figured out that they choose professions where they didn't have to be stuck someplace. So that's why they chose professions that were more intellectual. It's like, I can be an accountant anywhere, and I can be a doctor anywhere. I don't have to be in one particular location. It's like, that is very, very interesting. So I'm thinking, what thing can I do where I don't have to be in New York? And there's a lot of professions like that. But what am I good at that I could transfer and do in San Antonio, Texas? Well, I don't have to be in New York City to do what I'm doing now to get paid. I just got to get paid doing it.
Really interesting and really well put. Even though, I would say I was aware of, the Jewish situation, but that's really interesting. And then, so here's the question. That's a good philosophy to have. And now if you can combine finding a city that you think is really cool, and I know you've seen probably what you would say, like many, a surprising number of cities. And let's face it, 70, 80 years ago, you would have not traveled across this country and fallen in love with as many places as you can now. Easy example is food. The old joke, you go on the road 50 years ago, and boy, there are good reasons to miss New York City. Unless all you like are one or two dishes, you miss New York. My friend would joke he would tour in the South and with a band, and he would be missing Chinese food so badly. And they'd found a Chinese restaurant, and they were all excited, and they went in there. The menu looked pretty good, and the decor, it just seemed like, oh God, finally. And the waitress came, and they put in their orders for spare ribs or whatever. And as she took the menu, she said, "Okay, great. Now y'all can help yourselves to the salad bar." And, that was my favorite way of illustrating what you would miss.
Funny.
But now, come on, actually for a good 20 plus years, okay, you might argue that the variety and the quality is still better in New York, but that would be more by virtue of the size of the city and the history of there being great places. But so many great places have opened up around the country, so many more ethnic neighborhoods around the country, so that I would always miss Vietnamese food. And now there are Vietnamese communities in tons of cities. All right. So again, a long-winded way.
Tangent alert.
Yeah, exactly. So you find the city that you love. You can do your podcast from anywhere. And that's a big thing in this country now with everybody working from home. But then the final piece of the puzzle is socially. Do you move to a city where you don't know anybody, and you're willing to start from scratch with a social life? Or do you work really hard at finding a place, if there is one, where you have more than one acquaintance? Because that's the other piece of our puzzle, yours, mine, and everyone else who thinks about this. To start, if you're a social person, it's a big deal to leave all your friends, man, and to go to a place where you might know a couple of people. They may or may not have time for you when you've moved there. And are you cool with working hard because it takes a little effort to meet all new people and make new friends.
Yeah, I know. Starting all over again at 60. But look, man, like I said in our phone conversation, I'm 55 now at the time of this recording. I have 45 years
Yeah.
left.
Right. Oh, it's good to
So
be determined at the very
yes,
least.
I know when the end game is. I got 45 years left
Yeah.
until I hit 100. But,
My dad's going to be 95 in February and
wow.
still has all his marbles.
Oh, that's good. That's good.
Oh, yeah. Pretty great. But anyway, yeah. So it's good to have a plan, man. What if I asked you, I'm the interviewer, first city that comes to mind? You sort of mentioned Northern California, San Diego.
Man, if I say this, I've said this when I visited this place a couple of times, but when I was with Ain't Too Proud in Northern California, I said if San Francisco could be in a climate like San Diego,
Oh God.
it'd be perfect. But it would have to have a different government. And the reason why I don't do that other podcast because I was talking about government overreach.
Right.
Not going to do that on this podcast, but I just can't see myself living in that area right now.
Yeah, Northern California. Well, the sad thing is, and we won't get into politics, but
Can always edit this out too.
that's true. But I look, I'm a big lefty, but I think the point I would want to make is that it's a little heartbreaking. You mentioned San Francisco, and the first time I went there, I was on that Will Rogers Follies tour. Our first city, we were there for a couple of months, and I couldn't have been more excited because San Francisco had always been the one city in our country, other than New York, that had this special aura, except for maybe New Orleans, which is amazing as well in its own way.
Yeah, forgot about New Orleans.
And you go to San Francisco, and I'd never heard of the Tenderloin, and that's where all the theaters are.
Yep.
And this was 30 years ago.
Oh.
And even then, you had to work after you're at the theater every day. Like, oh, this is why I can see it from a distance, but you have to work to find what's great about San Francisco. And then, yeah, you fall in love with it because it's not a vertical city. It's cool. It's unique. It has all its charms. But what I've learned is that in some ways, San Francisco, and this is where it's a little political, I was just there because I did the Hello Dolly tour a couple of years ago, and it's heartbreaking. It is indicative of what's been going on with the rest of the country. But because of politics, it's been really hard to help that city along so that it can even stay the same, but it's gotten worse. But that then it gets complicated because it's not an easy solution, but it's heartbreaking. If every city could have the climate of San Diego, though, yeah, come on, unless you really, I love all four seasons, but yeah, San Diego is insane. And the homeless problem there has always been awful because it has the best weather in the world.
And you understand why certain things are the way they are because you can just sleep in the park. But look, there is a lot of culture in San Diego. In San Francisco, there's a lot of history. Going to the Haight-Ashbury district and the Mission district and the Dogfish area. I think it's Dogfish, whatever it was, and Golden Gate Park. It's just beautiful. But yeah, you got to walk over people to get to the theater every night. No, and step in feces and no, I'm good.
Yeah, it's hard. And the feces are, well, never mind. I was going to say human feces, but that's a reality that you have to deal with. Well, let me ask you this then. You don't have to say you considered it specifically, but what about, see now, I think we've all fantasized about this, but the older we get, who knows, but moving out of the country.
I had a chance to visit Paris for 4 days, and I fell in love with that place too. Not only because the food is fantastic, but it's elegant. I mean, it's just, of
Yeah.
course, it's historic, and it's just the language is beautiful. I haven't been, I haven't been to London. I went to Lugano, Switzerland, for to play with an artist, and just to listening to the language of Italian. I mean, it's, oh my God, I think it's the most beautiful language I've ever heard.
Hmm.
And then looking at the, again, what I need is mountains and water, and they had both. They had these beautiful mountains. You drive. I can't remember what mountain range you drive through to get to Switzerland where we were, but it's just
Right.
beautiful over there. I need to go to the south of France. I need to go to Morocco. I need to go to uh, Spain. I mean, Portugal. I need to go all these places. I want to go to Japan. I haven't seen any of these places. I know people that live in Bangkok. Again, things have changed over the past year because of what's
Yeah.
happening, but there are so many things and so many places to see. Again, I have 45 years left. I'm trying to see them. I'm trying to see them, but I'm focusing right now on what I have to focus on, which is raising my son. Even though I don't see him that much, but um, yeah, I have this show that I'm doing,
Yeah.
and just trying to lay the foundations for the next chapter. And I'm very fortunate that I was able to play in 5 different shows, three Broadway shows and 2 off-Broadway shows. But during that time, again, I didn't know who Stephen Sondheim was, because when I was doing Tick Tick Boom, I was trying to be like the Roots and trying to be in that crowd. I had dreadlocks down to my back, and I was playing the, what's it called, the New York Poets Cafe,
Right.
and
Right.
playing behind rappers, and and then playing in singer songwriter people at CBGB's Cafe, and then playing CBGB's in a metal band. I was trying to do all of that stuff. So I've done all I want to do. I've done New York City. I came coming home at 6 o'clock in the morning after going to a club that, the club closed at 4. We go out to eat. I get back in. The sun's coming up. I've done all that stuff. So I'm trying to, the thing that I didn't get a chance to do, which I'm probably too old because I don't know. Maybe it'll happen, but I always wanted to play Madison Square Garden, or
Ah,
the Staples Center or something like that. Big
right.
rock band. I just want to play with Lenny Kravitz just once.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, the things that the ways we're similar and the ways that we have different versions. Like I've never played the Village Vanguard, and that's a sort
Mm.
of a bucket list thing. But you're bringing up an interesting subject, which is, even as we get older, you sort of feel like, at least for me, and it sounds like for you, the struggle with life is wrapping your brain around the idea that you don't want to think of, now we're getting like bottom line philosophy. You don't want to think about life about being about the big payoffs and about the, like, when you feel like you have a checklist, you want to do different things, but you have to accept the fact that the best life probably is, you're going to be left with all these other things that you want to do. When you started talking about Europe and Asia and the place you want to go to, and I've gotten to travel certainly a lot more than the average human being. I'm a little heartbroken now to think that I'm not going to be able to travel nearly as much outside of the country as I had planned. But while I'm still in good shape, which hopefully for a while, I have my youngest brother lives in Spain, but there are tons of places that I want to go to that I've never been to, and tons that I want to return to. And and musical goals, I worry that as much as you might have a checklist, that the worst feeling is going to be that you've checked them all off. And now what? So as long as you accept the fact that, you're going to go out with a huge checklist left, that's
Mm.
that's one way of thinking about the best situation, because life still excites you, the unknown, the things you'd like to do. So I know this all goes back to the cliche of it's all about the ride and not about the destination, which is really what I'm saying. But to be more specific about what you and I have been talking about, the traveling, the like, oh, if only in another life I lived in San Francisco, and San Francisco in its best version. You just kind of have to balance that openness to whatever. You're never going to fulfill everything, but you also want to be practical and not just live life aimlessly necessarily, because to accomplish things, you have to have a certain way of planning and a certain way of checking off things you want to do. And right now, you and I are, hey, after COVID, we know we're lucky to have the show. We take a breather and realize we're part of this thing that people pay to come see, and they're seeing it for that one and only time. And it's pretty damn exciting for them. It better be, because the ticket prices, what was the joke you were making with Paul Pizzuti? Like, wow, we're paying $30. It better be good. And now
it's
oh,
300.
Lord. Oh my God. So you keep that attitude. And when it's time, you can plan like, oh, I'm going to do this for another 2 years if the show lasts that long.
Right.
But you kind of also count on the idea that when it's time, you'll know when you go like, all right, I'm done.
Yes.
If you're still not sure and you got the gig, or more to the point, when something else comes along that says that you want to jump on, that's a great excuse for you to make the change. You're open to the future possibilities. But anyway, waxing philosophic in a clumsy way.
Next steps, things that came into your life, going back to your life story again. After Ragtime, you did Follies, or you were the rehearsal drummer for that show?
No, I did the revival of Follies, which, on your list of things that you wanted to cover, really hard to pick the favorite show that I played, because they're all so different. Just like picking your favorite drummer, I was going to say, it's all in the context of the bands they were playing in, because I would never go by like a YouTube video of some drummer playing by themselves that blew me away. So in the context of favorite shows, I would say that Follies was particularly special. First of all, hearing that music with the 28-piece orchestra, and I've been incredibly lucky in that 3 Broadway shows I did, all with Jim Moore, had 28 pieces in it, which is huge, literally and figuratively, for the biz of Broadway. And Follies, we were all in the pit. It was all acoustic. And needless to say, it was kind of tight, which was kind of cool, because I had Ray Kilday, one of the most solid bass players you could ever work with, just to the left of my hi-hat, and Greg Utzik, one of the most solid, great guitarists you could have, literally in front of my drums. There wasn't tons of baffling, I don't believe. And to lock in with those guys, especially with certain tunes, and to hear that music acoustically was particularly special. I mean, the show starts out actually with a very impressionistic sounding piece before you play what's technically the overture, where I don't play, and it's 3 or 4 minutes long, and it's beautiful. I would sit there for 3 minutes, listen to the orchestra play that, and then bam, do this show busy 2-beat overture. And it was that was a special show. I mean, but there are a few though that, for different reasons, yeah, tough for like a favorite show, but Follies was special.
How long did that run?
That was meant to be a limited run. We started in the fall, and they extended us a couple of weeks into January. It just had a great cast, and as with many Sondheim shows, it's particularly special for the fans of musical theater and of Sondheim in particular, to not only see a production, but to see it full on like that. And we got to record that. And yes, I've been on a bunch of cast recordings, many of which are still not the one and only. They were revivals, but it was still a pleasure to put that down
Did you get a
for
chance to
posterity.
did you get a chance to meet Stephen Sondheim?
I met him a few times, not enough to make any kind of super connection, but the most meaningful experience with Sondheim was I got to do this Sondheim Festival at the Kennedy Center in 2002, which was like summer stock at the highest level. I say that in all modesty. It was all DC musicians except for myself and a different conductor for each of the 6 shows they did in repertory. And I did the 2 shows out of the 6 that had drum set. And Sondheim was there for every show. As you've probably read or heard, and I know many people have when they've been reading obituaries and tributes, that he was very involved in as many of his productions as he could be. And he was there. I did company with the original orchestrations and with Jonathan Tunick conducting it, which was kind of wild, that, playing the show with a great cast, and the orchestrator is there conducting us, and Sondheim was there for the rehearsals. And then I did Merrily We Roll Along with Eric Stern conducting, which I've told people the funny story. Eric, who self-professed tightly wound guy, but a brilliant conductor, Sondheim would, during tech rehearsals, was sitting in the front row of the theater right behind Eric, standing on the podium in the pit, a relatively shallow pit. And at one point, they were sort of figuring out how to do something musically that matched something on stage, and they couldn't figure out what to do. And Sondheim said, well, I think you should do it this way. And Eric, he turned around and he said, no, I think we're going to do it my way. So let's just try it that way. And everybody just like, shut the fuck up. Like, what? He just turned around and nothing was said. And you knew, because if you know Eric, he's a great guy, but he's so, how do I put this? So, opinionated is not the right word. He's just so aesthetically tuned into what he does. He couldn't help himself. And you knew by the expression on his face that as soon as he said that, inside his head basically exploded. And the next day I saw him in front of the Kennedy Center and I said, Erica, how's it going? And he went, oh my God, I called Steve last night and everything is fine. But, and Sondheim he was a lot of different things. He could be hard, but of course it's his works and he wanted to make sure they were represented well. And he was very, very specific about what he wanted. I'm saying this because though I only met him a couple of times, like you had asked, I did see him in action a bunch, which was a privilege. And, but he also was a very giving guy and a softy, even though when you hear him interviewed, he seems very intellectual, which he also was, and very here, I will say this about him also, of all the artists I've seen interviewed to talk about their art and explain it, and, the other extreme is Miles, who might say, rightfully so in some ways, if you can't hear it, I'm not going to explain it to you. However, Sondheim could explain things in really interesting, illustrative ways that makes you understand his head and how he composed and ways in general. He's a great person to listen to talk about art, whether you're specifically into his music or just the creative process.
Cinderella.
Another thing written for TV by Rodgers and Hammerstein that was never live. So actually, though, that was, having done a lot of revivals and things like the Encores, I've done a few original shows, but Cinderella, even though the music had been written for TV, I think like 1960 for Julie Andrews, and then it was done again in the late 60s. David Chase, who I would give a shout out to, who orchestrated that and rather arranged all that music. The TV version was kind of staid, and Rodgers and Hammerstein you want it to really sparkle, because otherwise it's, for today's audiences, it might be not bland, but well, Cinderella needed a little sparkly touch to take something that was done for TV in 1960 to make it a live show. And that was an interesting experience because yes, at a level, it was me and the pianist in the rehearsal room, and they were really, in this particular case, on the fly, changing things minute to minute, where Andy Einhorn was our conductor, but during that rehearsal period, David Chase was running the engine, tweaking things minute by minute, second by second, giving it to our copyists, changing the music. Yes, I was reading the piano score, trying to make up a part. And that was 5 weeks down to tech rehearsals. And then, of course, things still get changed during previews. But that was an interesting creative process. And David Chase was particularly amazing to create a show that was the longest thing I did on Broadway. I think that was 2 years. Among other people, I mean, it's weird. I'll just, not to be a little sad, but I went from Follies working with Danny Burstein, who's been through so much publicly, and then his late wife, Rebecca, did the fairy godmother in Cinderella. She wasn't the original, but I just, they're on my mind. I've been thinking about it lately, and yeah, there were some special people in that show as well. Also a decent sized orchestra. I've been well, I'm not going to complain that it's 14 in company because they're badasses and they sound great. But one of the luckiest things for me, Broadway wise, is having done shows with large ensembles.
What's the largest ensemble that you've worked with?
Well, on Broadway, it was the 3 shows that had 28, and another show, I guess if we're talking about my career, that had 28 besides Follies and Ragtime, which we did the original orchestrations, was On the Town. And in some ways, that was the greatest show that I did because I did get to do West Side Story in Europe. And to answer your other question that you had on the list, the hardest show in that you wanted to play that, it was a hard show and you wanted to play every note right because that score demanded it. You wanted to play West Side Story. So On the Town, I had only known a few of the songs. It wasn't as complex as West Side Story, but Bernstein's music is so freaking amazing. And it means the orchestrations are also amazing. And here's a guy at the time was 24, 25 when he wrote it. It was a great cast. It was a great production. And importantly, the producers recognized the thrill of having that large of an orchestra, and they used it as a big part of the promotion. Back to talking about what it sounds like when you're in the audience. When I sat in the audience for that show, because I wanted to see it, not always, but when it was, there's a lot of incredible dance in that show. When it was dance and it was ballet and it was meant to sound like a great classical concert because so much of that music has been done by major orchestras, and you hear that dance suite. It's funny, the sound guys not only cranked up the band a little bit, but they added reverb because, and I think in their mind, it's like, oh, if you're hearing a symphony on stage, we want all that extra ambient sound. Whereas when we were playing more of the show busy parts of On the Town, I think they took off some of the reverb, maybe also because if they're singing, they don't want that extra wash. But On the Town was, man, that was a thrill. And that recording we did, there is a recording of On the Town pieced together by some people involved with the original that Bernstein conducted. But this was a comprehensive recording that came out really good. And we did that in Manhattan Center. Have you ever recorded there? That's where they record orchestras and movie scores. And I'd never been in a huge hall like that. I'd only been in the studios in Midtown. And I think as far as by a little bit, of the cast recordings that I'm on, I'm pretty proud of that. It came out great.
Is that one cast recording that you find to be your favorite?
Uh, I might say the one that I would enjoy listening to, which I would guess that it's come up in some of your conversations, that all pit musicians like to famously say, I got my copy of the CD and it's still in the wrapper. And as much as I don't listen to Broadway music that much, I'm thinking, I'll be honest, if this is the legacy I'm leaving artistically, I want to listen to it once in a while, even if it depresses me, because we're all so critical of our own playing. And I think, well, I'm the dude that messed up this recording, more than anybody, because this was less than perfect. But having said that, I have On the Town on my iPhone and I'll listen to it. And certainly, like every other Broadway recording I'm on, it ain't about the drums in any way. It's just, you know what I'm saying? I mean, the jazz recordings, as much as they'll never be enough, I don't have enough of me on that. That's where I'm expressing myself personally and interacting with the other musicians. But the Broadway stuff, if I listen to it, it's because it's great to hear that music. And man, I'm sorry, Leonard Bernstein. I might love other Broadway composers. I love Jules Stein. Of modern composers, Ragtime is really dramatic. A lot of things I like, but for the whole package, Leonard Bernstein with just the few shows. Well, I don't even know the other ones. Just West Side and On the Town, but there's something satisfying about that music on the most levels, if that makes sense.
Tell me about Dames at Sea.
Oh man, ironically, not ironically, sadly, that I left. Did I leave On the Town? Because the producers pushed that show way beyond what they could afford to, because we got great reviews. Audiences loved it, but it was a tough sell and an expensive show. So at the end, I did jump ship because I think, oh, wait a minute. No, what am I saying? I'm confusing that with another show. I'd stayed to the end of On the Town pretty much, I think. Dames at Sea, the reason why I'm saying this is because that was a hard show to keep going because it was a huge, expensive show. Dames at Sea was written for a cabaret act where they had 6 performers and I think 2 pianos. It was meant to be a funny spoof of the old Busby Berkeley movie musicals. The biggest shtick being that they had 6 people and 2 pianos to recreate something that was a huge, over-the-top Hollywood musical splashy thing. And it was all hammed up, and the 6 characters played the archetype characters in those old movie musicals. And it was cute and it was funny, and it introduced the young Bernadette Peters, and it had never been done on Broadway, even though that title, you think, oh, I heard of that one. That must have been some old musical. And Rob Berman was the conductor for that, taken over by David Gursky. And it had great tap dancing, a really funny, very game cast of 6 people playing these old-timey characters. It was a great band. I got to work with John Beal, the bassist, who I always worked with in the Encores, but I'd never done a Broadway show. And instead of 2 pianos, I think we were 9 people, 8 or 9. So we were larger than the cast. And we played on one side of the stage in the wings. And it was fun to play, because all the shows I do at some level are fun to play, and I enjoyed doing it. And the main thing I was hopeful for was it was a small theater and a relatively cheap show to put on. And I thought, well, all these shows I'm doing that are so expensive, eventually they can't sustain it. Here's one of those shows where, they got a profit. They have to make $200 profit a week, and we'll run for a while. And I want to run in a show so long that I quit because I've had enough, not because after 2 months they say, thank you, good night. And it didn't last. It lasted a few months. I had a blast doing it. The end.
That doesn't bring us to where you are now. You did Holiday Inn in 2016, right?
Yes, and that was also a limited run because it was meant to be a Christmas show. And that was at Studio 54 on the heels of the show that Paul did, which was, oh, no, it wasn't his Kiss Me Kate revival that he did. By the way, you joked that he did them both. And I was listening to the podcast. I went, well, Paul, you didn't do the original. That was in the 50s or something. But they had just done a musical there. It's so funny to do a musical in Studio 54.
I've never been in there. I really want to see it.
Well, here's the thing, man. It's a theater. It looks like a lot of other theaters. I guess if there is a pit, it's been boarded up. But as you've heard, unless the band is on stage, what they've famously done there is they put the band in the balconies on the little side box seat areas. And if it's more than a couple of people, half the band is on one side of the stage, the other, and everything is remoted and they make it work. And I was wondering how it was going to work. It was not as swingy big band as I told you as White Christmas, but it was still Larry Blank, and they write great charts. Notated a little heavily for drums, if I might say. I've never seen a show the way it came out, apparently, and whatever the program is, it was just like your brain, too much information. It was overwritten, but the charts themselves were good. And, appropriately cornball, but shit, Irving Berlin tunes that were so classic, fun to play. Got to record that. Also another movie musical that had never been done live. And I think
there's a theme here,
I know, and I'm not even realizing it as much until I say it out loud.
Movies.
I know. Hey, it's well, I wonder what movie musicals that had never been on Broadway are left. Maybe I'll still have a career. I was just going to say, as an aside, Studio 54, man. I was never into disco, and I moved to New York in 81, which there was still, certainly, as long as Coke was big, a lingering scene at Studio 54, but that was from the mid 70s or a little later. The real heyday was, I don't know,
78.
Yeah, and like a few years in particular. But just to be in that theater, which otherwise felt like, another Broadway show, another Broadway theater, and to know that, somebody was sniffing Coke off of Cher's Tushy or something. I can't believe I said that. That's going to go out to the public, but that's not hyperbolic. I'm not to say that it literally happened, but all the crazy stuff that happened there and the debauchery, and it's incredible. So like a lot of things historical in New York, your imagination might run wild when you're backstage at a place like Studio 54.
After Holiday Inn, did you wind up going on tours? Did you have other shows after that?
Well, the truth is, after Holiday Inn, a couple of life changes personally, which is not interesting, but it was a lot of things happened right around then that just made things a little tough, only in this, or mainly in the sense that we all can't sustain. I mean, I was lucky for about 7-8 years in a row. And I will say, as much as any musician is lucky to have a show run a million years, I think we all fantasized about, I want to be the guy that does a show for 3 months or 6 months. And then a contractor calls me to move to another show. And I have a few months off in between to play other stuff. And you have that fantasy variety where you are working all the time, but not on Broadway all the time. And you you do different shows. That's something we have no freaking control over. But I had a little bit of that for 7 or 8 years, which made me feel really lucky. And then it was a little slow. It was rough. And when it's a little slow in the freelance world, it can be particularly tough because it's not like you have a huge savings from the steady job you had for 20 years before that. It's up and down. So it was tough. I didn't work that much. I had the Encores. I was probably finishing the last couple of the 11 years I think I did of the Kennedy Center Honors, which was a whole other exciting gig but I only did once a year, but amazing. But it was slow, and nothing seemed to be coming my way for, not that I expected to get my own show, but I also didn't sub very much. That's something that's, I might have a calm demeanor on the outside, but I have a hard time with the stress of going into sub on a show. So I waited, and then I realized, touring is fun. I'm not sure I want to do it again, but if something comes up and it's the right thing, and long story not so short, I found out Hello Dolly was going out. Then I found out Bob Billig was conducting, who I had a great experience with years before that at the Kennedy Center. And it was like, done, I'm going to do it. And coincidentally, with what you were saying talking about with Paul Pizzuti the other day, I went and watched Buddy Williams play that show. And we were all probably interested, curious, and amused to think, here's this icon of R&B in the 70s and 80s. And we knew he had a history with Bette Midler and that he had done Motown, right? You subbed for him on that. I did not know Buddy personally, and knew how that whole story had played out, which is great if you have a TMZ gossip show to do eventually about, the seamy side of Broadway musicians. But Buddy was doing the show. I watched him play it, exactly what Paul said. Super, super simple, almost more simply than I would have. Well, I wound up doing it for 16 months on the road. They did combine the books. So at first I thought, I have to play timpani and bells too, but I was glad because it was very much the stereotypical classic boom chick show. Wow. Not that every show is hard. I will say that as well, that technically simple does not mean anything with Broadway. Either you learn to play the show in the beginning or not. After that, it's just, are you finessing it so that the boom chick sounds really good? And I'm still learning how to do that. But Hello Dolly was simple. I was glad to eventually have the extra percussion to play. Buddy was fun to watch because, yes, man, I know he's an R&B player. So that bass drum anchor was metronomic and so solid. And that's probably why Paul, who's probably more vaguely in the same category of a drummer who comes from a similar background to me, as opposed to Buddy, who, that 1 and 3 on the bass drum, you know what I'm saying? And that anchor, not the anxious sound of Broadway, where everything seems to have this edge to it, which is appropriate for Broadway, even though drummers, we want to be metronomic, but it's not going to get much better than Buddy. And I'm sure, that sounds like the world you come from as well. So if we're categorizing drummers, a fun distinction is to hear him play something like Hello Dolly and appreciate what it is that's so amazing about him. That might not have been the first thing you thought of when you think of a choice for Hello Dolly. Yet Bette Midler, that was her comfort zone. She wanted to know that Buddy was in that chair.
Right.
Buddy was hysterical. When I said,
yes,
he had one red LP woodblock. And I said something like, wow, like the percussionist has everything else and you just have the one woodblock. I'm surprised, they didn't give you a few more toys or whatever. And he just turned to me without, blinking an eye and said, man, I don't do that shit. You know, it's like any extra toys and show busy stuff. He's just, not that he couldn't do it, but
right.
he, and it was cool.
And he said it in his deep baritone voice too.
Oh yeah. And he was, grateful to have the gig and all of that.
Yep. I remember him always saying, man, this is your world, man. Because when I subbed for him at the Color Purple and at Motown, I was like, man, this is your world. It's your people. Because, he said he doesn't do that much Broadway. I guess maybe when I interview him, I'll ask him.
Yeah. Well, did he do anything before Motown on Broadway?
I don't think he did. He might have, but I'm not sure. I'll find out. But yeah, he but look, it's his world now.
It is. And hey, I don't know. It's a combination of the personality of the person. Like if you got him to say, hey, sum up your experience on Hello Dolly. Well, it's complicated. That show had its complications, but it's always interesting. Here's another thing of the many facets you're going to find out as you talk to drummers coming from different places, their actual experiences and what actually happened to them matching their attitude about what they say. I mean, Buddy might say, like, I wasn't necessarily looking forward to Hello Dolly, but I'm glad I did it. I had a great experience. Or it's whoever he is, he might say, oh God, that was just so not my world. I shouldn't speak for him, but you know what I'm saying? It might have been cringeworthy for him in some ways, although I think we can be sure that if you're playing with other great musicians, it's never cringeworthy. The music might be the furthest thing from what you're into, but that's what I'm not dissing the music that I am playing, certainly not now or ever on Broadway, but it's always more about the great players you get to play with and me looking around going, what am I doing here? It's not that I come from the generation, I'm older, where playing Broadway was my dream. But when I did go to Broadway shows, it was a huge deal. And it's a certain level of professionalism. And yeah, I got the history of guys. Yeah. And gals.
I say that a lot when I'm doing my show. Really. I'm playing and I'm listening in my cans to Keith Robinson and Larry Saltzman playing guitar, and we're playing Just My Imagination. You got Keith picking the part, and then Larry playing these beautiful chords, and I'm just playing.
Yeah.
And they're just grooving. And you got George Farmer on bass. I'm like, I can't believe I'm doing this. And
I know.
I said that to myself when I was at Memphis the Musical. I was like, I can't believe I'm doing this. I'm getting paid at the time a lot of money.
Has that changed? Well, yeah.
I was single. I'm like, man, this is the greatest thing ever. And then now I'm doing this podcast, and I gotta say, I can't believe I'm able to talk to Bill Lanham and Sean McDaniel and Paul Bazzuti and Gary Seligson and Shannon Ford. I mean, the list it's growing and growing. I was like, these are my colleagues. These people are my colleagues. I can't believe I'm talking. Yeah. And I can call Buddy Williams and say, you want to be a part? He's like, yeah. I can't believe I'm doing this, which is partly because I worked all this time in New York, busting my butt and dragging drums around and playing CB's Gallery and playing, all these small clubs and working my ass off to get to this point. I'm very grateful, but I'm like, I can't believe I do this. And it's a wonderful experience. And I don't take this for granted.
Yeah, really important to feel that way, to express that, to remind yourself, because we're all going to feel down for whatever reason about stuff. And that's certainly one of the things that keeps me going. And yeah, give yourself also the kudos that, when Keith and Larry are playing guitar, and I got to work with Larry on the Kennedy Center honors, and yeah, he's a badass. that when he hears your backbeat, he's also pretty damn happy that you're there every night as well. So we don't want to take that for granted, and it's not a forced thing where we're just saying that to ourselves to that we don't believe it. I do believe it, and I am humbled by it. And yeah, I even still wrestle with the not deserving of doing it, because if I look back and I go, all right, I did these things. If I do listen to stuff, sometimes I dig this, man. It's not a big ego thing per se, but if I do want to relive an experience and with a little distance and perspective, I'm sure we all have recordings made from the pit, and not necessarily the ones made crudely, but maybe that we got from the soundboard or something, or even some of them were made from an iPhone or something. I have a recording of White Christmas that was made by, I guess I can reveal this in public now, Paul Woodiel, great violinist, made it on his first iPhone, the first iPhone to come out from where he sat. And damn it, listening to the recording of just one night in the pit, and in that particular case, the balance was pretty good. Once in a blue moon, I'll play that. And sometimes the grooves are better than the recordings, because in the studio, it's a whole other thing to get in there and, wham, bam, do it real quickly. And it feels a little different. And you don't like the take they took because I rushed and whatever. But I like listening to those recordings. And that's where I feel most proud. It's like, wow, I got to play with these guys. And you don't even have to like the recording throughout, but there are just moments where it makes me smile and go, at least I did this.
Right. Should be proud. Well, I have we can talk.
How are we doing time wise, man? I you know what, you managed to get the two parters, because I'm guessing there's a lot of good ground covered, but I don't have the perspective sitting here yapping away, and I see we're on
almost on hour 3. Yeah, 2 hours and 46 minutes.
Yeah, 2 hours and 46 minutes. And God, well, I don't want to make your editing job even. Well, maybe your editing job will be easy. Take out 25 minutes here and an hour here. But anyway, go ahead, man. Sorry.
No, I don't want to wrap this up, because I could talk to you because we haven't even talked about. There's a lot of stuff that we could talk about. Like, for instance, your experience playing shows and getting certain shows started from the ground up. You've done a lot of revivals. When you go into a situation like that for rehearsals, you get handed the piano vocal.
Right.
And you have to come up with a drum part. Do you go back over, like for a revival, are you going back and listening to the old recordings, or are you just coming up with something on your own to do it your way? What do you do? What's your approach?
Really good question. First of all, setting aside the encores, which for the most part, the absolute goal is to give the audience a sense of what it was like to hear the show. Seeing it is different, but to hear the show the way they might have heard it originally. So in that case, you really will go to the recording, and if not play it exactly like whoever it is, we'll never know who a lot of these musicians are, because sadly they never list them. But even with revivals on Broadway, for example, Follies, it was actually Paul Gimignani playing drums. It was the last show that he played drums before he switched over, because I think he was an associate conductor on it and took over. But actually, in many cases, drummers who are still anonymous to me. But personally, I like copying the styles that I hear of drummers on the recordings. It's interesting to me. I sort of like the history of it. And so I will try to recreate that unless I hear the recording. I know I'm going to be playing orchestrations that, if they're not the same or similar, if I somehow feel like, oh, I can throw in a little bit of my own thing. On the Town was the original orchestration, 28 pieces. So many times Bernstein's conducted, or other great conductors have conducted, like suites, and you hear every drummer play it a certain way. I want to cop it so that it doesn't take away from someone experiencing being taken to a time and a place. So I do try to cop that style. In the rehearsal room, when you're with the dancers and just piano, what makes up for the drag of just playing with drums and piano and it being a long, tedious process, for me, is mostly offset by the fun of getting to know the conductor, the associate conductor, pianist, and the people in the cast, which gives you if you're lucky enough to do extra rehearsals, gives you an advantage that the rest of the band doesn't get. You do a few rehearsals with the band and you might never see them backstage. And that rehearsal process is nice. And also, if you are, whether it's Cinderella, where you're really creating, even though it's Rodgers and Hammerstein music, I really helped create that part with David Chase, I think. Or if you're just recreating what was on a record, sort of, kind of, you're not really getting to do that in a satisfactory way in the rehearsal studio with just piano, because it's not in the context of being with the orchestra. Needless to say, and you know it, and everybody you've interviewed knows this in a big way, a big thrill you get to experience is, especially after being in that rehearsal room for weeks, and forgive me if every drummer has said this, but you've been rehearsing with piano, and then you get to that orchestra rehearsal, and everything you've been playing out of context, kicking the band, little passages, and maybe you've barely even gotten to look at the actual part that you were going to play. You've been reading off the piano score. In Cinderella, being thrown sheets left and right in the middle of playing. We've changed this, we've changed that, and yeah, it might just be 2-beat or a waltz or whatever, but a triangle here, a rim shot there, the choreographer's changing everything left and right. That's fun. It's exciting. I like that process. And then you get into Carol's rehearsal studio or wherever, and you can see it on everybody's faces, from the conductor, from the table of people sitting there with their scores. And, I'll give it up to the fact that the rest of the musicians do not have that same experience. It's everybody who's been working on it for that long, and then you hear it. And then, of course, after those few rehearsals, you do the Zitz probe with the cast, and they get to hear it. And I know you've done shows where the cast, you might hear someone in the cast interviewed separately, and it feels good to hear them say, you know what, one of the greatest moments in the whole experience doing the show is doing the Zitz probe, where we got to sing with the orchestra after a month or two in the rehearsal studio. It's pretty freaking exciting.
My first experience with doing that was when I was in Seattle, another great city full of great coffee.
I love it.
At least it was. I don't know what it's like in 2021, but
maybe still okay.
Okay.
Compared to some other cities that have gone down the crapper. Yeah.
So in Seattle, doing the rehearsals for Memphis the Musical, working with David Bryan, and him telling me, yeah, play it like Tico, meat and potatoes, just playing the bell of the ride.
Yeah, George told me about that a little bit. Right.
So we were doing all this stuff, and I played, 16th notes on high. He'd do this, and I'd know what he meant, play 16th notes. But anyway, I'd have to play somewhat softly because we're in the rehearsal room. But when we did the Zitz probe, we got to play with the orchestra,
Right.
And I was like, man, I'm about to play this, y'all. I'm about to play this. And, it was a rock show, really, even though it's supposed to be about Memphis music. But, man, I couldn't wait to play that. And we played it, and the cast was just excited, and everyone was excited. It's just, like you said, it's a really, really exciting time and a great feeling to get that done. And
Oh, yeah.
then it all slows down. You go into the theater, and then you got a week of tech rehearsals.
Yeah. Look, it is what it is, but you're right. That's exactly why that one experience, you're never going to have that again in the experience of doing that show, is that build up. And when the orchestra rehearses and it comes together, and then, yeah, even when you go into the theater for the first time and you're still able to play out,
Yes.
you're all in the same room.
Yes.
And yeah, it can't be beat. And as a drummer, it's funny. You said, when you said, I'm doing this, y'all, looking around like not everybody, no one's going to really understand it the way you do in a certain level, unless you talk to other drummers, because the cast has their one view. The other musicians who haven't been doing rehearsals have theirs. Maybe just you, the conductor, and the associate conductor. And it's a special feeling.
Indeed. Since we're almost in hour 3, I probably should get going soon, but I'm going to ask you a couple quick questions. I don't know if they can be answered really quickly, but
I will try, man. I got to be better at being more succinct, but it's just great because, yeah, podcasts are all about more casual conversation. So,
and the interesting thing is, I was talking to you, I was thinking about, man, I'm going to have to cut this into 2 or maybe 3. But then, you know what?
oh,
Joe Rogan, his podcast is 3 hours long. And again, he's Joe Rogan. He's been around for a long time. And he's got
right.
people that are on a different level in popularity than we are. Not
Yeah.
So
Can't compare them.
Right.
You're doing this specially for certain people.
But people do listen to his show for hours. I mean, I don't necessarily do that, which is interesting. This is the reason why I split things up, because people, they don't have 3 hours to sit there and listen. So they might listen to the first hour of their guest. But I ask these questions because they can be taken apart and edited in a certain way.
Of course.
So what do you think drummers should always do playing Broadway shows when they're in the pit?
That's funny. I can look to one side because I wrote a few notes when you gave me the list. Ask me that question again,
Okay.
because there are a few basic things about what to do as a Broadway drummer, and I want to be sure I'm answering the question.
What should a drummer always do as a drummer in a Broadway pit?
Well, once you get past the fact that you've learned the show and the people are happy with you, what you should bring, if this is sort of what you're asking, I think you need to bring a certain default level of energy, enthusiasm, and consistency, because the worst thing, once you've started a show, is putting out the sense, either overtly or even subtly, that people will notice, even if you're in your own booth, you're not even in the room, is if you're a sourpuss and you're bringing down the vibe musically and socially. I think when you have to do our unique gig night after night, the problem is someone who, it's rare that people aren't relatively consistent, because that's just who we are. And that's why we also are rehired for Broadway shows, is because, not that a lot of our heroes who play their asses off couldn't do it if they wanted to, but for whatever reason, they haven't chosen to, or they don't have the constitution for it. You come in and you bring it more or less every night. And then finally, to wrap up this answer, I think a conductor, they still might hire you in the future. You still might be a go-to guy, but if you're a drag to be around, if you're not, you don't have to be perky all the time, but just show a sense that you're happy to be there, more or less. That's what I would say.
On the flip side, what kind of things shouldn't you do as a drummer in a Broadway show?
I think it would just be the opposite of what I just mentioned. If you're disruptive in some way, I use that word and I wrote it down, and I'm thinking, well, once in a blue moon, people are being a knucklehead in the sense that instead of it keeping things fun and light. And I say that you can even be edgy and inappropriate in some ways, but if I think you sort of sense whether this person is like that because they want to have a good time versus the people who are just dark. And that's not cool. That's not to say that people who are quiet types or whatever, you are who you are. But I think I can only speak to what it is I like to come to when I come to work, and what I would imagine a conductor, whether they say it outright or you just have a sense that this is what they want, is, look, it's hardest for that conductor that we don't always think about, where we all have to bring it every night at a certain level, and the conductor's not playing. We see conductors go sort of on automatic pilot because they're human, but we always have to remember that as much as they want that band to sound great, they have on their shoulders the extra pressure of knowing that the director of the show, the stage manager, it's on their shoulders. So this is my way of saying, don't make them, just as we want to have a great relationship with that conductor, because night after night, it's all about that relationship, you and the conductor. If you go out on the road and you don't get along with the conductor, that's freaking torture. That's why have some sort of level of relationship so that the conductor is happy to see you. And again, it doesn't mean that you have to be chipper. But this is an intense thing we do, in that sense that we have to do something that's very mechanical, exactly the same thing every night, but it's in the arts. It's a very weird, unique thing. And it sounds corny, but bring some level of joy or positivity that maybe gets people off the hook who are not ebullient. Is that the right word? Who are just like chill and whatever. That's fine, but don't bring the vibe down, because it's hard to come in night after night and do that.
Speaking of being disruptive,
yes,
I don't know how true it is, but forgot what pit he was in. Again, I should probably ask somebody who was either there or knows, but I've just heard stories of Dave Spinoza.
We're getting into TMZ zone now here. I've met Dave a bunch of times. If I worked with him, it was very briefly in passing. Go ahead.
Oh, really? Well, he would do stuff to he, in his own way, I guess, shake things up.
Right.
And I just heard a story of him, so he was talking to somebody and their music stand, the person was like in front of them, but they were sitting down facing him with their instrument, and their music stand was in between them. So he'd take out his penis and then he'd lay it over the music.
All right. Wow. Well, now see, that sounds like
that's a little bit.
That might be if that's really true, and it could be, or it happened once and then sounds like he would do this. That's kind of intense, man. I would have, yeah, that's pretty disruptive. And look, I like to think of myself as, we could go into the whole other thing about my love of comedy and some other things, and having grown up next to a comedy biggie, but I like edgy as much as the next guy, more than the average person. So, going back to what I said before, the vibe in the pit, if the band is able to keep up a certain level of quality, if it's cool with the conductor and the pit, and they're much probably less rowdy for a long time because of how competitive Broadway has become, as opposed to the days when it wasn't as serious. The drinking in between shows and sometimes in between acts.
Oh man,
Yeah,
that's a whole other thing.
that's the whole podcast, as we often say when we're doing a podcast. That's a whole other podcast.
Exactly.
But if there are cut ups and consistent cut ups, yeah, those are things that keeps it going so that people are happy. And you sort of know the difference. If people are doing that because it keeps things light when you're in year 20 of The Lion King,
Right.
and that's a whole other podcast too, because famously they haven't been so happy over the years.
Right.
But if people are doing wacky things because in a positive way, hopefully the indication is that's good and it works. Here's a sort of a in-between thing. It's not as bad as whipping it out in a show like what Dave apparently did, but I used to sub for Ray on Damn Yankees, and I won't name names now, but I guess people can look it up. But people were into bringing in porn and putting it on the music stand, like cut out, like we cut out pictures from magazines when we were little kids, and it was even
put it in between people's music.
Yeah, but or just on the stand where everybody could see. And it's like, really, I'm not talking Playboy. I'm talking, and this sounds sexist of me to qualify, Playboy bunnies versus Hustler magazine or
Right.
really low end stuff. But you get the idea. And I would come into sub, and I'd have my own music, of course, and I'd always have to clear off this crudely pasted, taped together pictures of all this stuff. And all right, you've been doing a show for a few years, however, whatever gets you through the show. But there was a woman on the side of the pit by herself, who, the only woman. And eventually I heard she, complained about it. And it's interesting that in those days, she probably was very hesitant. And, well, I won't say any more because then I'm getting into names where people can figure out who it is, but it became problematic. And I feel bad that a woman should absolutely be made to feel uncomfortable that she's in a section of a band and she has to stare at this stuff and guys joking. And I think even somebody got on their monitor. Someone was watching a ball game and got it on their monitor, and then it wound up being fed to the conductor. And I mean, there's some really funny, jokey things. And in the end, you have to evaluate, well, is this disruptive and fucked up in a way that's not good for the job? Or is it depends on the conductor, sometimes what they're willing to allow. Or is it just like not cool? And there were some not cool things.
Going back to one of your interests, there's always a list. Is Citizen Kane number one on your list of greatest movies of all time?
Oh man, you know what? Let me ask you this as the host of a podcast. It's good to ask who your favorites, I think, or what's the greatest, knowing full well that many times someone's going to say, I don't have one. There's no such thing. Because a good question shouldn't have an obvious answer. It's just illuminating because of how the person answers it. And I will say that I couldn't tell you who my favorite 5 drummers are, even, because I know that was one of your questions, or favorite movies versus the greatest movies. Citizen Kane, without a doubt. I watched it many times in college. I did a paper on the music, is one of the greatest movies. But making a list is tough I haven't seen it in a long time, and I suspect if I watched it now, I would still appreciate it for in all its glory. And funny that Orson Welles, a true genius, just as the quintessential dude who at a certain point he fought Hollywood, he couldn't keep it together, did a lot of silly things, and the second half of his life, like a lot of classic artists, was so not in sync with the genius promise that he had as a young guy. And how old was he when he did Citizen Kane?
His 20s, right?
He might have still been in his 20s. I mean, the War of the Worlds radio thing he did with his acting troupe was before that. But Citizen Kane was 1940, 41, something like that. And a kid, man, that's a whole other podcast too, about the cliche of the great artists who do their best work by a certain age, and then it's hard to sustain. How much of it is them? How much of it is the public's demands and expectations? But anyway, I'm digressing again. You wanted to talk a little bit about my love of movies and stuff, and yeah, I could talk about that. Citizen Kane is great. I have a huge poster right above me of Taxi Driver. That there was a period where I saw it many times in a theater, and that's a great movie. And there are some movies that we loved and we watch them now and they seem real dated, and some that hold up, and that's still a matter of taste.
Yeah. Well, I tell you what, we've already formed the corporation and we've already trademarked it and we're already in production. So don't even think about this idea, but me and Rich are going to be doing Taxi Driver, the musical.
Oh my God. Oh, and of course there is going to be a tune called You Talking to Me.
That's right. It's going to have the typical Broadway thing. You talking to me? Bring.
Oh,
you talking
man.
to me? Bring.
Well, here's the thing about that. It's funny you should say that, because back when you asked me that earlier, I was going to say, what serious movies made in musicals? The thing is, we've already been covered by that for like 3 decades with The Simpsons, South Park, and Family Guy, taking care of those spoofs so brilliantly.
Yeah, it's true.
And everybody who does those, they could be mocking Broadway in the funniest ways. And even things like Waiting for Guffman that, Christopher Guest did. Everybody who does those and are the best at them are the ones who also, they don't have scorn or disdain for Broadway. They love it. They get it. They can embrace the corniness and they can still skewer it. And it's hard. Once I saw, was it The Simpsons that did a musical of The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and it seemed hysterical. And then, of course, they did one. In all seriousness.
Well, you think about a show like Book of Mormon and how irreverent it is, and people love it. Man, I got to tell you, I saw it, and I was like, okay, how bad could this be? And by the middle of the second act, I was like, oh, my God, I can't believe they did that.
Yeah.
So, look, they did it, but they did it very well. And the music's great. The story's funny. There's a way that, like you said, you can be creative. There's a way to do just about anything.
Yeah. However opinionated we all are. And there are so many times I think, oh my God, a musical about this and this and this. It's so wrong. I'm super opinionated about so much of that stuff, but I got to keep going back to that bottom line of when it comes to art. And, look, Paul Pizzuti yesterday was talking, and I know I've talked to Paul about this many times. His attitude about avant-garde jazz is very much like, it's noise and I can't get into it, whatever. Really dismissive of it, the way a lot of people are. And it's always a matter of taste. I can't get into hip hop, but I never want to lose the fact that when I start saying it's not art or it's not music, I'll slap myself, because it's not that we judge it by how popular and successful it's become. It's just at a certain point, you have to recognize that once we start trying to define what art is, it's the end. It's the end of what art is. Because it has to be no holes barred, anything goes, and it's not so much that it's up to the public to decide. It's just art is really you're expressing yourself and communicating to somebody else in something beyond everyday. Oh God, now I'm trying to define art, and I'll step on myself because
Well,
I haven't thought about this. You know what I'm saying, although I think is that
yeah.
it has to be totally open. And I've been to a Sun Ra concert.
Mm.
I was so into it and it was amazing. And I'm not going to look back and say, what was I thinking? I loved it. Do I say that you have to be able to play bebop in order to make free music sound better or more coherent? Do you have to have that history? Did Jackson Pollock have to also be able to paint realistic stuff to give him credibility? You might think so, but as far as saying it's not art, I would say
Yeah, I got to tell you, I grew up on hip hop, and there's a documentary series about hip hop on Netflix that I rewatched because I wanted to just go over, which I feel is the golden age of hip hop, which is like 1984, 85 to like 1994, and looking at how Run DMC had a record called Sucker MCs, and it was just a drum beat and then rapping over it. And they played it to people. They're like, okay, when's the bass going to come in? Where's the music? They're like, no, that's it. They're like, what are you talking about? There's no music. It's just a beat. And it turned out, when I first heard it, I was like, this is what's happening. This is really cool.
right.
And my father's like, turn that stuff off. But look, I'm older now. I don't like trap music. Trap music is what's happening now, and I
I
guess
don't even know what that is.
Yeah. Well, it's the same. It's been what hip hop is for the past 15 years. I'm like, could somebody please do something different? I'm looking for somebody to shake things up, and I also think about the generation that had to live through 2020 and 2021. I hope that they create something that is so revolutionary. And I don't know if if anything new can be created, because I believe personally that the greatest music has already been created. I don't think human beings, I believe, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and up until hip hop, tried everything rhythmically and melodically possible. I mean, people were just
Wow.
taking drums and poking the heads in and rattling around and taking a water bottle and pouring water on something and seeing if it can make a sound. People were experimenting, partly because there was a baby boom and, the times of the 60s. And it was turbulent. 1968, one of the most pivotal years in world history. I think that we pushed all the boundaries, and the only thing that's different is technology, which, again, could be something to create new.
That's true. There's still the human element. Can I pause now? I've been having such a great time talking with you also. I made plans for
You got to run.
4:30 in
Oh,
Midtown,
snap. All right.
and I thought, man, I hope you cut me off after a couple of hours because I'll go on, but I didn't think it would go this long. And I'm thinking, man, you're bringing up another subject, about art and hip hop and our expectations. I could talk to you again as well. And if you want to do it again, I'm
Yeah, let's do
totally
it
into
again.
it. Are you serious? Because please, I certainly don't think what I have to say is any more important, if that, than all the other guys you've had on your show. It's just, obviously I like talking. And when it comes to arts and the aesthetics and with a fellow drummer who I'm just getting to know, I love it, man. I love
Yeah,
it.
it's a different this is probably the most different distinct conversation that I've had, because it's not all about drums. It's about many other things that we're into. So, yeah, let's do it again.
All
Let's
right.
call it 2.5 hours of the act one.
I apologize profusely about what I've left for you editing wise, but I don't regret doing this. And man, thank you for asking me. And whether you want to do a sign off now so that you at least have one, or you're willing to talk again, I'm game for it because, yeah, I loved it, man.
We will do this again.
Clayton, thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure. And yes, to be continued, and also in person for whatever, a slice, a bowl of ramen. Our show lasts, 2 hours and 55 minutes.
Ooh, Lord.
I know. And you can't mess with a classic. I'm sure they would have liked to have said it's 2 hours and 20 minutes, but it is what it is. So all I'm saying is, you know what my break's going to be like? We will definitely get together, man.
All right, man. We'll talk soon.
Thanks, Clayton. It was a pleasure.
All right. Talk to you later.
Bye.